121st District, Luzerne County.
Martin Causer, 67th Legislative District in McKean, Potter, and Cameron counties. And I want to thank all the members today. Our topic is challenges facing our dairy industry. So today we're talking about challenges facing dairy farmers across the Commonwealth. We heard at our last informational meeting that we held at the Farm Show Complex, we started to touch on these issues and some of the challenges facing the industry. And Chairman Paszynski and I thought that it would be very appropriate for our committee to have a hearing specifically focused on dairy. And I appreciate the presenters that are joining us today. I'm looking forward to the information that's presented, and I'm very hopeful that that will help our committee as we move forward with ways to help Pennsylvania dairy farmers. So with that, I'm going to turn to my co-chair for comments, and then we'll get moving with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's indeed my pleasure to welcome as a new member here today, Austin Davis. He's one of our new guys on the block. Very happy to have him serving on the committee. And of course, we're very excited to have Senator Vogel give us an idea of what it's like in the dairy business. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here as well. And a big shout out to all the FFA kids back there who make things happen. Way to go, kids.
Thank you, Chairman Paszynski. And in addition to welcoming our newest member, I want to thank Representative Ryan for joining us today. He said he was a visitor, and he asked to be able to join us today, and we certainly welcome him. We do have an impressive panel here today, and I want to thank them for joining us. And our first guest is Secretary of Agriculture, Russell Redding, who certainly needs no introduction to this committee. We welcome you, Mr. Secretary, and you're welcome to proceed.
Mr. Chairman and committee, it's great to see you. Thank you for the opportunity. I appreciate very much the chance to follow up from our conversation that we started during the farm show on this topic. And, you know, as I listened to each of the introductions, you know, the counties that are touched, I mean, there's not any that don't include this dairy conversation either directly in production concerns, processing, or certainly from a consumer standpoint. So pleasure to be here with you and to join the panel. It is always good to be with Senator Vogel. I think this is the first we've been actually on this side of the table together, so it's a good feeling. I'll provide sort of an overview. You have the testimony. I'm not going to go into that. We wanted to provide some background for you. Today's hearing will certainly be a launching point to talk about what the state does, what can we do. It informs that discussion of, you know, the challenges facing the industry. So you have the testimony. I'll try to give a little bit of overarching perspective from the department, from the industry, and then certainly look forward to the questions. But as we have noted before, anytime that you're talking about dairy in Pennsylvania, and particularly you know, the issues that we're talking about that are so significant, producer concerns and infrastructure concerns, this industry you know, is $3 billion, is 37% of the gross ag cash receipts in Pennsylvania. So it is not an insignificant piece of the conversation that this makes it even more important today. Dairy's history, as I note in the testimony, is really about this partnership that has existed between the producers and processors, academia, cooperative extension, and certainly government of all levels. I note that because I think as we move forward, expanding that partnership becomes even more important and certainly becomes part of this solution. We have learned in the last year and a half or two that the balance between what is produced and what is consumed matters a great deal. And right now that balance is out of balance, and that's really what is the underlying issue here of concern. We outlined in the testimony sort of a roundup of the Department of Agriculture. We're frequently asked about the support for the industry, and as we sort of did the inventory, you begin to see where the Department of Agriculture touches both the programmatic side of the industry, but also where our support is with both our partners at Penn Vet, Penn State College of Ag Sciences, and certainly the Center for Dairy Excellence. But we did that also to note that we have involvement at many points, both on the production side, on the research, but also in the food programs. Again, to point out that that engagement, that involvement is also part, we think, of the solution going forward. I have described this current dairy situation is sort of this perfect storm. It is this confluence of things. It is partly what has happened in our own production capacity in the United States and in Pennsylvania. It is a combination of what has happened to the world market and what is playing out in Europe particularly. It is also a piece of our increasingly dependence on exports. And then what happens with that? 17% of our U.S. production is exported around the world. You couple that with these domestic issues, right, of production, of the change in cow numbers, production per cow. But we also have to look at the changes occurring at the consumer level. And the study that Dr. Novakovic and team looked at, some of these changing consumer trends are incredibly important to us, like consumption of less fluid milk, right, over the years, and increasing consumption of yogurt as one example. In a relatively short span of time, we have gone from 210 pounds of milk consumption to 154 on the fresh side. On the yogurt side, we've gone from 4.5 pounds of yogurt consumption to 13.7 pounds. So you begin to sort of look at what we are as consumers consuming and the impact that has on where we are in our own sort of response, ability to respond here at the state. So that is a basis. But these trends really form the basis of the study that was commissioned with the Center for Dairy Excellence. We saw this, right? It wasn't completely uninformed that we stepped into it. Admittedly, there's no good solution. There's not an easy solution to it, right? It's not like there is one of these components that we can change that begins to turn the price at the farm income. It's a combination of things. So I will defer to Jane Seabright from the Center and Dr. Novakovic to talk about the study. But it really is important to also look at the other document that we issued, and many of you were present for this during the farm show, which was our economic impact, which studied Pennsylvania agriculture and had some strategic recommendations in it. Each of those, in the testimony you'll see, we go to some detail of looking at the recommendations and where does it apply to this conversation of dairy. And again, we can talk more about that, but when you look at capitalizing on the branding and marketing, when you look at the infrastructure conversations, and certainly diversification. So in closing, I'll just say, for me, there are three sort of takeaways of the studies, and the studies are both the dairy study that was commissioned as well as the economic impact study. Number one, to remain both economically viable and relevant will require some bold ideas. Being competitive on the farm, in the boardrooms, and most importantly in the marketplace. Two, as we noted during the farm show, the strength of agriculture in Pennsylvania is in our diversity. And I just look at this dairy industry and want to make sure that as we move closer down this path of this path forward, which we're all sort of searching for, is that we are mindful that our strength really is the diversity. What does that mean? It means making sure that at the end of the day there's a place for the Amish, that there's a place for the English, that there's a place for the smaller dairies and the larger dairies. That is our strength. That is a differentiator for the state of Pennsylvania, and I think has a tremendous consumer appeal as well. So that diversity is embodied in, I think, the opportunities that we have to differentiate Pennsylvania dairy. And final point, that this study that was done is about, it's about us. It wasn't done for the dairy, it was done for the Commonwealth. And really taking that comprehensive view of it, that'll require all of us having faith in each other, that we can find a solution that is reflective of our diversity, reflects the economic significance of Pennsylvania, but is also one that is a call to action, right? It's going to require us to do some things differently, and that's on the investment side we can talk about, on the infrastructure, on the farm management. So I look forward to the conversation today. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Are there any specific questions for the Secretary at this time? Representative Diamond?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony this morning. So, some of the things that come to my mind when I think about this is our ability. I mean, I understand that there are global forces at work here. There are federal forces at work here. And that we, in light of those, we have somewhat limited power in the state to deal with a lot of those particular market issues. But what we can do is help to provide a buffer for our dairy farmers when price decreases start impacting them. And one of those things that we can do is to have more processing facilities in the Commonwealth where we can process milk into products that have longer shelf lives, that sort of thing. So I was wondering, part of the problem with putting a processing plant is some of the permitting and the wait times on the permitting that needs to be done in order to do that. Do you see any room for Department of Ag to take over any of that permitting process to help kind of grease the wheels a little bit so that anybody who does think about putting a process facility in that would help provide this buffer might have a smoother path in their timeline from development to completion of such a processing facility?
Well, I'd say a couple things. One, based on the study and the release of that study, we've already launched sort of a search for sites in Pennsylvania. Okay, so it was in anticipation of. Now, that was only in anticipation of. We don't have anybody at this point who's sort of raised their hand and say we're prepared to build it. But we wanted to get to this question of what is the right location, what's the right infrastructure, look at the permitting. We've had two conversations, one with DCED on the economic development side, the other with DEP on the permitting issues. And then there are a host of sort of federal components because of the food related that are also we're aware of, but we're not in control of that. So I don't see the department, beyond what I've just laid out and or for the individual food safety inspection component that we would have jurisdiction over as a state, taking over responsibility, any greater responsibility for, the physical site permitting.
And just to follow up on a different topic, the Pennsylvania Agricultural Surplus System,
Yeah.
Do we have room for that to breathe a little bit, to take up a little bit of this slack in the market so that that system can absorb some of the slack in the market?
Yeah, so the representative's referring to the Pennsylvania Agricultural Surplus System, which the committee knows is part of our budget and is funded at $1 million within the State Food Purchase Program. There is room there, and I'm pleased to say that the dairy and the diversion of some of the fluid milk into cheese processing has been incredibly valuable, both in terms of an alternative market for some of this milk, but also, just from a great nutritious product, the tradable food system. We should all be proud of that. The limitation is the appropriation. there just isn't enough money, to divert as much milk as available into that program for processing.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Mao.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you again, Russell. I will
Good to
be
see you.
quick.
Thank you.
Can you, and very quickly, tell me or tell us what the repercussions would be, either pro or con, of floor pricing for dairy products or for milk marketing? I mean, I think we went over this a few years back, but refresh me if that would be good or bad for the dairy industry.
Yeah, this may be a question better answered by an economist, Dr. Novakovic. I would just say that, part of the challenge if you put a floor price under, and a little bit of history here, back in the 1990 Farm Bill, Congress up to that point had an established floor under dairy, basically, and then did away with that, and ever since, we have been on these sort of cycles of ups and downs. The question's always going to be, what's the right floor? Right? What's the right sort of foundation under the price that sends the market signals that you want? I would point to Europe as a good example where they have a floor, and Dr. Novakovic can talk about this, but they have basically a floor that at this point is about $20 per hundred. For comparison, in the United States right now, we're sort of in the $16, $17. So they have a floor. It's encouraging production, overproduction that's contributing to our problem. I don't know. I'm always hesitant to say that the floor is the right answer, right? Because you have to have some way to judge the market and respond to that market. I would rather have it be more sort of open without the floor, but importantly for us in Pennsylvania, more competitive, and put our dollars into risk management and processing.
Without a floor, though, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, doesn't that make small farms more susceptible to bankruptcy?
I don't know if it makes them more susceptible to bankruptcy. I think it's, it's where it certainly allows them to have a more predictable future from an income standpoint. It wouldn't foreclose the bankruptcy question, though, right? So I think the challenge has been to have markets that, particularly in our dynamic where 17% is exported, how do you price that? You've got to be competitive in the world market for those prices. At the same time, how do you satisfy this sort of middle spot of it's not such a floor that it encourages the production, because that just exacerbates where we are, but it's not low enough that it's insignificant. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Keller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, as always, good to see you.
It's good to see you. Thank you.
Just want to ask a quick question here on your thoughts. Do you think the legislature should pre-qualify the word milk? And where I'm going with this is we have almond milk. We have, that claims that it's milk, and to be a little more clear on that, how it is identified in the stores, of what the nutrition value is with our actual milk itself versus the almond milk, the other that they qualify. Do you think that's something that we should be looking at?
Well, it's got to be done, short answer is yes, but it has to be done on a national level, right? I would just say that that's certainly something that Congress is looking at, and there's been a lot of conversations about having the real milk label, right? I think that's absolutely critical. Yes.
Thank you. My response to that almond milk is, show me how you milk those.
Representative Zimmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, good to see you.
It's good to see you.
So it's 4 years ago, we were like at an all-time high with milk price, and since that, it's been steadily dropping. So within the department itself, what have you changed, or what has changed, or what's the most significant thing that has been done to try and help that issue? I didn't have a chance, and I apologize, I didn't have a chance to actually read the testimony, so you may cover some of it, but Just like to hear your perspective on that.
Well, I think there, over that span, it certainly could point to any number of the bureaus. I would say, much of our effort has been working with the Center for Dairy Excellence, beginning that conversation over 2 years ago to look at the trends and concerns that were being expressed by the dairy industry. Constant sort of inquiry from from the food industry, and particularly dairy processors, about opportunities in Pennsylvania. Those conversations have been very active. Any number of investments that we've made in dairies, both through the PIDA program as well as the Next Generation Farm Loan. Advocacy, going to Canada, engaged in Mexico, the Tri-National Accord. I mean, there's a whole host of things that we've been involved in on this. A big part of that, by the way, has been sort of the federal, just for point made earlier, that so much of this dairy policy is federally related, is making sure that our PA congressional delegation is aware of what Pennsylvania farmers need. So all of that in this sort of stack of dairy support.
Yeah, okay. Good. Well, then to follow up on that, Mr. Secretary, is that I know the Center of Dairy Excellence has been used a lot and is doing some really good work, and I know that, the department has, used them a lot and been in dialogue, but concern that, as some other years we've, from the administration, we've decided not to fund them. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been around this long enough. I mean, this has been one of those issues. There are a number of items in the budget that are, legislative add-ons, and we've gone back and forth. We did it with Tom Ridge, we did it with Rendell, we did it with Corbett, we're doing it with Wolf. I mean, I think that's, a discussion, we can have as part of our appropriation. What we tried to point out, though, I think importantly, is in the department, there are many ways that the department actually touches dairy and supports the dairy industry, right? It's what we do, arguably nothing more important, quite frankly, than doing the diagnostics and the animal health pieces of that, and the food safety pieces of dairy are probably as critical. What we do through the center, again, important, it complements the work of the department, funding Penn Vet, funding Penn State University College of Ag, are all critical pieces. So look forward to the conversation about funding.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr.
Representative
Chairman.
Kubulich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, always good to see you. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Senator, also, thank you for being here. Looking at your testimony, your printed testimony, your concern about with the new ag census and possibly the number of Pennsylvania farms with dairy cows dropping again, and also with the decline in the consumption of fluid milk across the United States. Then combine that with the increase in the use of yogurt and processed cheeses, plus the fact that, again, in your testimony here, you talk about how we're not up to the processing capacity of some place like Wisconsin. Do those factors keep you awake at night or concern you? The fact that we're dropping in the use of fluid milk, but yet we're still a ways away from having the processing capacity to accommodate the growing yogurt and processed cheese market?
Yes.
Thank you.
It's a concern. I mean, I think that's really the importance of this study is it puts a spotlight on, some of the trends. It puts a spotlight, importantly, on some of the solutions. And if you look historically at Pennsylvania, our strength has been our ability, to produce milk locally, supply a fluid market, supply the larger metropolitan area around the Northeast. And then what we see are the trend lines changing on types of products that consumers have a preference for, coupled with that, the infrastructure that we have to process those products that are, in demand. And I think therein lies our challenge for all of us. How do you respond to that? And particularly, how do you do it on some, timely basis, right? It's going to take some time to turn that. The trend line on the number of farms has been a trend of the last 40 years. The cow numbers are about even, farm numbers have dropped. So that piece is less of a concern. I hate to see anybody exit, but a real concern is whether you can compete in the marketplace. That's what I was trying to get at in the testimony. We've got to be able to compete. And that's both at the farm level, of course, in the marketplace.
Is that something financially that the Commonwealth is going to have to look at or step into to help some of these facilities get up to speed if we get to that point?
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's the conversation occurring right now. I mean, I don't think we should assume, even though 7 of the last sort of 9 major expansions in the United States have occurred by cooperatives. I think given the discussion that we've had for the last number of years, I think we all have to sort of ask the question, who's going to make the investment, right? Who's going to build it? And you need a market. I mean, there are the 2 unanswered questions in this study. What we've tried to do is to anticipate the who piece. I think the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania clearly has to be part of that. That doesn't answer the market question, but it does answer how you build, the financial package, if you will, to make this investment. The state needs to be part of that.
Representative Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, great to see you as always.
Good to see you. Thank
you for being before the committee today. I appreciate it. I think everyone in this room would agree that the challenges facing the dairy industry in the Commonwealth are largely due to global market forces that are, frankly, probably beyond the control of anybody in this room. With that being said, we do have the resource of a resource that a number of other states do not have in our own milk marketing board. Do you think there's, particularly given the challenges the dairy industry is facing in the Commonwealth today, do you think there's more that the Milk Marketing Board could be doing? Do you think there's anything else they could do to help particularly smaller dairy farmers in the Commonwealth?
Well, I think first, I think we ought to be, proud to have, a milk marketing board in the state. I mean, very few states have any state pricing authority, and there's been hotly debated issues around whether that's right or wrong and serves all the purposes we want it to serve. But at the end of the day, again, it is a differentiator for Pennsylvania, and we ought to, take full advantage of that. There are, with that body existing and the infrastructure, if you will, that they have of relationships within the industry, we should look at how we leverage that relationship for the benefit of processing, even though their focus is on, the milk produced, processed, and sold here on the fluid side. We should explore whether they have an opportunity to guide us in some discussions around the processing of other products. I think to the committee, I think having this conversation about if you see the trends playing out either by census or just the demographics of Pennsylvania agriculture, is there something from a public policy standpoint that we want to do for those smaller farms where the Milk Marketing Board could actually be an answer to that? We should talk about that, right? But that's a departure from where we've been historically. If we really want to target those, don't know how to do that, but I think that is something that's certainly worth exploring.
So my understanding is that with regard to the makeup of the board, is that the chairman is beyond his term at this point. I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe you can confirm it for me. If it is, my understanding is one of the other slots might be coming up with vacancies soon. So my question would be, does the administration have a timeline for handling these potential vacancies, or what's the plan kind of going forward for the board?
Yeah, so to answer the first question, the current chairman term has expired. Those discussions are underway, but we are supportive of Mr. Brubaker as chair. And there's a consumer rep vacancy that will come up. And we're working on, soliciting names for that consumer rep.
So my understanding is the chairman's several years over his term. Will he be renominated, and what is the timeline for that?
Yeah, I don't know the timeline. There have been active conversations, for the last year on getting the appointment finalized for him.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Paszynski.
In view of the time limits for Senator Vogel, I'm going to hold my question so that the senator can present his case. If that'll be all right, Senator?
One additional question from Representative Ryan. Of course. For the secretary, or? Okay. Any other questions for the secretary? If not, Mr. Secretary, are you going to be staying with us if questions come up? Or thank you very much for being here today and for your presentation. So. Next on our agenda is Senator Vogel. Senator Vogel is Majority Chairman of the Senate Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee, and he's also a lifelong dairy farmer. So we're very glad to have the Senator here, and appreciate you taking your time to be here with us today, and look forward to your comments today. So welcome.
Oh, thank you, Chairman Kaiser and Chairman Paszynski. First off, I want to say I'll plead my case. I'm not guilty, okay? But then I was asked by Carrie to just sort of kind of give an overview of my 60 years in the dairy industry. My family's 60-some years in the dairy industry, and highs and lows. And what I was thinking back the last few days since they asked me last week, it's not a whole lot different than what it is today. Basically, I mean, my family farm was started in 1874. My parents bought it off my grandparents in 1954. My dad got out of the service. They started milking cows. And over the time frame, I was really jogged my memory here a lot, but we changed dairies, I think, 5 or 6 times as time went on, and dairies got bigger, and other ones bought out. We went through like 5 or 6, 7 different dairies in the course of our 60 years in the dairy industry. I mean, started shipping to a small dairy in Pittsburgh, and they went out. Then we shipped to another small dairy in Beaver. Then they got bought out by a dairy in Ian Valley, who got bought out by a dairy in Ambridge, who finally got bought out by a dairy in Evans City. So over 50 years, we probably roughly every 10 years, we were changing dairies. So obviously that is a issue today where people say, you know, there's only several things left. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was all consolidating even back then, you know. I mean, so it's just, I'm just trying to draw some parallels, I guess, from what was then to what it is today. And also, we go back to, you know, the price swings in dairy prices and things like that. I graduated from high school in 1974. In 1975, we added a addition on our barn, a couple new silos for myself to come on and my brother to come on when he graduated a couple years later. And about 1980 or so, whenever the Carter administration came in office, interest rates went to 19%. So we had $350,000 worth of debt that we're paying 19% interest on. So that makes it kind of tough to, when you're milking 50 cows, to, you know, take a situation like that. So looking on situations today, I mean, you know, a lot of these dairies, obviously they spend more than $250,000. They spend $1 million adding a dairy expansion. But to have the unknowns you're always going to have unknowns, obviously, because the price milk swings and things like that go on and on as well. But so I don't know. I mean, it's obviously it's something. Milk prices, they're in a roller coaster. They go up and down every year and a half or 2 years. I mean, obviously I think it's more volatile now than it was back then because we're in more of a world market. Obviously, what happens in New Zealand or what happens in Germany affects the price of milk we get here in Pennsylvania. I mean, if New Zealand has a drought, which it did a few years ago, our price milk went up because we shipped a lot more powder and products like that to the Pacific Rim that New Zealand usually covers Japan and things like that. But New Zealand didn't have the milk because they were in a drought situation. Their dairy industry is based basically on a grass industry because they get a lot of rain. So theirs is they don't have a lot of forages they grow. They basically graze their cows. So they ran out of grass because they had a drought, so they had less milk production, so they had less product to ship into the Pacific Rim, to Korea and Japan, basically. So our prices corresponded accordingly because we had the product to be able to ship off the West Coast to the Pacific Rim to fill that need. So, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of corresponding things that have changed because the prices do go up and down every 18 months to 2 years. They have in our whole lifetime. I mean, we no longer milk cows, unfortunately. My dad passed in December of 16, and we sold the cows then, but I missed them. But at the same time, you know, there's other dairies that milking more cows, and like you said, the number of farms have decreased, but the number of cows has basically stayed the same, so that tells you that other families are being able to add on a few more cows here and there and make up the slack for it. Once upon a time, there was I think 12 or 13 dairies on our 7-mile stretch of road. Now there are none. Right now, there's probably only 2 or 3 dairy farmers left in our whole township. There probably was 50 or 60 at once upon a time. I mean, just the effects of labor is an issue that we were all small family-run farms. I mean, but labor was an issue then even for us, because once I took my Senate job, we really couldn't find anyone to help. I'd helped as much as I could on the weekends and on days off and things like that, but we were able to hire a couple kids to help. But at the end of the day, basically my dad and my brother-in-law did a lot of the work that we needed to do, because there wasn't able to hire other labor to fill that gap and stuff. And it's an issue we have right now with the farms we have. They're larger and things like that, but still they need labor when you're milking cows 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, while you still need labor to do that. And it's whether you find Mexican labor or Puerto Rican labor or American labor, you still need the people to do the job. And it's an issue. It was an issue back then. It was an issue for us, and it's an issue now going forward here in Pennsylvania and across the country. Is the labor industry. Dairy is a very intensive business. I mean, it's 24/7. You don't get Christmas morning off, and if you get sick, you don't not go to the barn because you're sick. It's 24/7, and you milk cows twice a day, every day, and that's the way it is. People talk about you just don't miss holidays. You work your holiday around milking cows. And that's the way it's been my whole life. I mean, actually, the last year was kind of strange. I actually had to sleep in on Christmas morning, the first time I've done it my whole life, you know what I mean? But as my wife said, you don't know what to do with yourself. And when we sold the cows, I didn't know what to do with myself. I went down to the barn every day, and there was no cows there, but I still went down to the barn because I thought it had to be there. We still had some heifers at the time, but it's just one of those things. When you do it your whole life, you get used to it. But it's, I don't know, just the way it is and the way things are, and it's a very labor-intensive business, and people care very deeply about it. I mean, you want to be a farmer, you care very deeply because you're not in it to make a lot of money. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of times, at the end of the day, you'd like to make money, but many times I know we didn't make a lot of money at the end of the year. I mean, and that's pretty much no different than it is today and what it was back then. And so I don't know. I've rambled on here. I didn't know what else Carrie said. Just tell your story. So I sort of kind of laid out what I thought were some of the huge differences and some of the things that are the same between now and what's happened since 1950 or 1960 to today. So I don't know if anybody has a couple questions. I'll try and answer them, I guess. But thank you for having me here as well today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Vogel. It definitely seems like a very cyclical problem that comes around repeatedly. And I can see that, as somebody that grew up on a dairy farm myself, we always milk between 50 and 60 cows. I think at one point we got up to 75 and then dropped back to 60 again. And so it's definitely, and just the road that I live on, the whole time growing up, we had seven dairy farms on that road. And now today, I think there are one, and it's just barely holding on. So it's definitely a cyclical issue. And thank you for sharing your thoughts. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Are there questions for Senator Vogel, Representative Zimmerman?
Thanks, Senator, for sharing your story. It is interesting. Also, growing up in a dairy farm, without the cows, it's like, what do we do now? So, because that's the way of life. So a little bit different question, but a lot of conversation about NAFTA these days. What's your perspective and the idea of agriculture marketing in general, and especially the dairy industry the way it is? It's I believe the numbers were something like 37% of Pennsylvania ag products are actually marketed through NAFTA. So just your perspective on it.
I've probably going out on a limb here, but I think NAFTA is a good thing for the whole ag economy in the United States. We do tons and tons of trade with Canada and with Mexico. I mean, we ship a lot of pork and that into Mexico. We do a lot of grain trading with Canadians, and we do a lot of dairy trading with Canadians as well. I mean, there's a lot of dairy that's traded back and forth between the Canadians and us, as well as grain products and things like that, and a lot of products into Mexico. And the Pacific Rim is another treaty that I think needs to stay in place as well, because we do ship a lot of product off the West Coast into the Pacific Rim that I think, these are huge impacts that will have trickle-down effects on Pennsylvania dairy, Pennsylvania agriculture as a whole. I mean, if these programs and these NAFTA as a whole is changed or altered in some major way, we get into some little spitting match with ourselves and our neighboring countries, why it could have a devastating effect here, because a lot of our farms in Pennsylvania don't have the economies of scale that some of the other farms in the Midwest, the huger grain farms and pork operations and dairy operations have. So, you know, a few pennies difference here and there in grain prices or milk prices, you can see the impact it has on Pennsylvania now. I mean, so these kind of things, these trading partners being lost, I think would be a huge detriment to agriculture as a whole, but Pennsylvania agriculture would probably feel a little bit harder maybe.
Yeah, yeah. So they see the idea of fixing it rather than throwing it out is the right thing as far as NAFTA is concerned.
Yes, whatever they think needs to be fixed, I think I would try fixing it versus throwing it down the drain, yes.
Yeah. And I understand that back 4 years ago when price of milk was actually maybe at a high point, we were actually marketing a lot into China, for example, which that market's changed a lot, so anywhere we can market is important, so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, yes, sir.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Paszynski?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Vogel. And one of the most impressive things as I've taken the position of minority chair has been to meet wonderful folks like yourself, those in the farm industry that are dedicated, and I mean that sincerely. Most folks have no idea what it takes to run or operate a farm. You know, so I really appreciate that. And as Chairman Causer and I discussed this issue for months now, and with many of you, it was precipitated upon the idea that in Pennsylvania we're really dumping bazillion gallons of milk because we have no processing. But yet I'm hearing now that because of global markets and the possibility of not having a market to sell even processed material, are we headed in the right direction? In other words, if we had a milk processing plant in one of those 3 locations that the study pointed out, how would that change our situation? Would it change it to the positive so that, if so, is there something that we can do as state officials to try to move this thing forward?
You want my opinion
Who
on
would
that?
ever like, yeah, both of you, please.
Okay, well, yeah, it obviously would help, but once again, we have the changing demographics of America. I mean, we have more older people and less kids. And so I think that's an issue. We have less milk consumption because there are less kids in America, less kids in schools and things like that, and the older Americans just don't drink milk like they used to and should and everything. I mean, so I think just that demographic alone is a huge one. I mean, the Obama administration a couple years ago changed the formula for a percentage of, I went from whole milk to 1% or something like that in our schools, and that turned out to be a disastrous decision. I mean, I heard stories many times from our school officials where the kids wouldn't even drink the milk. They'd sit it on their tray, and at the end of the day, they just dump the unopened carton of milk in the garbage can because they didn't want to drink it because they didn't like the taste of it. So, I mean, how can you, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And we lost a lot of business that way, I think. And once you lose a kid that's not going to drink milk, you're not going to get them back. I mean, it's a thing you learn when you're a kid, and you either like it or you don't. And once you lose them for whatever reason, during their teenage years or whatever, you lose them, chances of them deciding when they're 40 years old, I'm going to drink milk again, is probably very slim to none. So I don't know. That's my opinion on it, for what it's worth.
Okay. Well, then, one of the other thoughts that I had as a new guy coming into this incredible agriculture business here in Pennsylvania was I felt as though we weren't marketing our product well enough. And I mean that because we know what PA Preferred is. I didn't really know what it was. And there's a lot of people out there that don't know that it's homegrown. When I was brought up, milk was one of the healthiest things you could drink. And the more milk you would drink, the stronger, healthier you would become. Is it because now we have all the advertisements of the new kinds of drinks and health drinks that are out there that has created part of this competition? Do we need to then refocus on the importance of and high quality of milk as being a healthy part of one's diet? I just offer that to you because it appears that we're in a downward slide where either the large companies are going to take over the small farmers and they'll operate it. I'm not sure. Again, I wanted to make sure that everybody realizes that what we were trying to do here Chairman Causer and I talked about this many times, and we heard from many folks about how many gallons of milk we're dumping because we didn't have any place to send that and produce products that could be preserved for sale someplace else. So now it appears, besides the cost and to try to get a company that would take this over, then we also have to find a market. So it's a multiple number of problems rather than when we first observed some of the information that we gathered. Do you want to add any more to that? Is it worth the effort to try to get a plant to produce the milk into the other products or not?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, what's interesting on the promotion and side, I mean, I get the dairy promotion, that's important, and there are check-off programs that are supported nationally in the state. What has always intrigued me, though, is that, you know, the milk is probably one of the most local product that you can buy. But it has completely been missed by the local foods movement. And, right? I mean, it's sort of fascinating when you think about where it comes from and how it gets to the store. We don't present it as a local product, right? It really is a homogenized product. And going forward, I mean, part of the conversation we have to have is not only around the products and what we produce, but I think the identity of Pennsylvania in a marketplace close to 40 million people, 50 million people. And how do we present Pennsylvania product, dairy included, within that market? That is part of this conversation going forward. So it's both the capacity to produce and produce to the products that we need, but it's also an identity of Pennsylvania within the marketplace. How do we do it? We talked about the Milk Marketing Board. I think that's another one of those areas that we should talk about what role that they could have in that discussion.
And I appreciate that, and it brings to mind, you know, New York is pushing really hard with advertising their agriculture. And I think that, you know, Pennsylvania is a very proud state. You know, we've got the Philadelphia Eagles, and we have the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Penguins, the Flyers, the whole nine yards. What I'm saying is, I think if the Pennsylvania people realized that they could help themselves out by buying Pennsylvania milk, that would help. And I'm looking for some answers out there of how can we market this incredible ag business that we have in Pennsylvania. The fact that Pennsylvania is an incredible place with the gift of the soil to be able to produce the kind of products that we produce, and so on and so forth. I'm saying this from my heart only because I don't want to see these farmers lose their love and produce the quality milk that they produce today, and just have huge manufacturing companies come in here and produce all that stuff. I think there's a certain identity that makes it very special for Pennsylvania. And again, I'm willing to work with anybody. I know Chairman Causer and I have discussed this probably ad nauseum, but we don't want to see this go down. We want to do everything we can to try to help that business out.
Yeah, I would just sort of like to add on to that. Dairy was rather slow, I guess, in picking up the PA Preferred logo. That a lot of other industries picked up, the apple industry, and those picked up the PA Preferred a lot faster than the dairy did. And I think pretty much a lot of the dairy is getting on board now with the PA Preferred logo system. But once again, dairy is a commodity that has a very short shelf life. I mean, it's not like you can buy a case of Pepsi and it can sit in your closet for a month. You don't have to worry about it. But you buy a gallon of milk, you have to drink it within, you know, a week or so. I mean, it's a very short shelf life. So that's an issue where you don't have the ability to keep it. They're trying to do some of this ultra pasteurized stuff where you can get extended shelf life on milk. At the same time, that's not totally around the country and everything. It's just tested, I think. I'm not even sure where that actually is right now at this point in time. But with a very short shelf life, you once again have the issue of you have 7 to 10 days or less to from the time it leaves the cow to somebody to drink it, or it's no good. So I mean, that's an issue where you buy a bag of apples or a case of Pepsi, you can put them in your refrigerator and stay there for a month and not have to worry about it, you know. But so that's a big issue that we have going forward too, is being able to, if we could at some point, extend the shelf life more, you would be able to do more things with it and promote it as well. And obviously, there's been other promotion things going on with the Milk Mustache was a huge milk promotion thing a couple years ago that went very well, but obviously promotion dollars are the big thing anymore. I mean, farmers are being asked to put checkoff dollars into promotion and things. You want to be able to see the bang for your buck at the end of the day, no matter what it's for, and there just isn't the promotion dollars to get something like that. Just do new that was a nationwide campaign, I guess, but to do specifically something for Pennsylvania like that, I don't know if, the advertising dollars are here to really to promote buy Pennsylvania milk. If that's a thing we could do, I think that's an issue that we have, an issue we could look at farther to try and do something like that. I mean, the apple growers and everybody else have, campaigns and stuff to buy apple, but, milk does to a degree, but not probably to the degree that we need to have to be able to sell our product.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Vogel, I know you had a tight time schedule with an appropriations committee hearing coming up. We had two other members that request for a question. Do you have additional time?
I'll stay. I'll just skip lunch, that's all.
Representative Tobash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I hear this recurring theme, and first of all, I'd like to thank Representative Lawrence for bringing milk and drinking milk at the hearing today. It's a good idea. It's well placed. I'm going to have a glass when we leave now. That's great. So this recurring theme, right? So you only have a certain shelf life, and we've got to supply. Representative Zimmerman and I were with a group of Amish farmers last week, and we hear their frustration, we hear their pleas for help, and we got a short shelf life, and we talk about NAFTA, we talk about the Pacific Rim at some point in time, other areas of the world needing product that we could possibly, well, right now we can produce, but we could process here. We've got a milk marketing board that's got some vacancies on it, and it begs the question, are we being micro-focused at getting somebody with some expertise and specialization in the processing end to try and encourage those businesses to come to the state of Pennsylvania, utilize our raw material, put our best foot forward to make sure we've got the processing capacity that can turn our milk product, the raw material, into something that we can keep for a while, like cheese, and export to different parts of the world that really need it. And what does your legislature need to do, Mr. Secretary, to give you the support you need to make Pennsylvania a leader in the effort of economic growth and supporting our farm families and our agriculture industry to make sure we've got the processing capacity to make our market really zing?
Well, I would say, a couple of things. One is, the financial support through DCED and those lending programs are critical. We have used every one of them. There's going to be a conversation about what the state is prepared to actually put on the table when it comes to making a decision of the processing plant. So I think having support within the DCED financial assistance economic development programs is important. Two, I think the support for trade, we've talked about it. We've tiptoed around this. You can talk about all the programs you want. There's nothing more important than trade to agriculture, right? 30%, pick a number of what leaves the United States and goes to the 95% of the stomachs that are someplace other than the United States of America. So very aggressive trade support both within the state and for our offices around the world. I would encourage the engagement with the Trump administration, particularly Secretary Perdue, on trade. I think the conversations over the weekend about Mexico and what that looks like, man, anybody here should be concerned about what that looks like for Pennsylvania. I'm really worried about it. So making sure we keep those channels open for movement of product are critical. The continued support for the center and what the center is doing, I think a couple of the recommendations that we make in the reports around what Pennsylvania can be doing, long-term investments in research and development for products. I've looked at some of the other states, and there are several competitor states in this category, but really looking hard at what Pennsylvania can do to produce, on the research side, produce products of extended shelf life, any number of value-added products. That's just a start, right?
So specifically, this idea that we've got a vacancy on the milk marketing board, what's the process? Is there a way that we can speed that along and maybe get someone in there with expertise on bringing a processor to the state of Pennsylvania? Is
Yeah,
there-
but I think you could have that conversation. Interestingly, the word marketing is in the title, but it's not. It doesn't market anything. It's about the oversight of the marketplace. It's not a marketing entity like a promotional board would be with our check-off program. So, but engage them. I think that having the conversation about what the milk marketing board can do and what the entity currently has in terms of authority and what we would like to see it have, I think, is a conversation here with the committee.
Okay, thank you. We look forward to you letting us know what we can do to help bring processors into the state to make sure our raw material is being utilized here and then exported to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Questions for Senator Vogel? Representative Diamond?
Senator, thanks for coming in today. Really appreciate your experience. One of my concerns whenever I hear about any kind of farmer being in trouble is that the next thing I'm going to see on that land is a tract of 330 townhomes, which cause a lot of other problems down the road that we want to avoid. So I wanted to ask you, from your experience, can you talk about the difficulties and challenges for a dairy farmer who sees that the market is no longer working for them, the difficulties and challenges in switching to growing another crop, raising other types of livestock, and just from your experience, can you talk just a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, actually, that's what my wife and I are planning on doing. We're going to switch from dairy to beef. We're doing some fence work and things like that right now, but it's easier for a dairy farmer to switch to beef, I think, than somebody else just because you have an animal background to a degree, and dairy and beef aren't a whole lot different, and beef require a little bit less work than dairy do, but that is an easier thing to do, but also to look at other crops. Obviously, I think it's a long way off probably, but the hemp program finally got started here in Pennsylvania, I think in a few years that could be it's not going to be a 100,000 acre crop probably anytime soon, but I mean, it has the potential to be a niche market for people to be able to do something else on their farms, to do a little bit of different, income sources and things like that. And that's what people need to look for nowadays is a lot of these farmers are going into niche markets in whether it's in growing some grapes and starting a small winery or starting a small farm market, things like that. Those are things you need to be able to think outside the box and be able to adjust to your area. I mean, we're right next to Cranberry. I can stand on my farm and see houses a mile down the road in Cranberry Township. They built to the county line because we don't have sewer and water, and that's the only reason they're not in our township is because we don't have sewer and water. If they'd give it to us, they'd be there tomorrow. But that's our saving grace at this point in time is that. But so obviously, and the price is very attractive. I mean, somebody wants to offer you a lot of money for a little bit of ground. We had a neighbor friend of ours in Cranberry Township, right across the border, a mile and a half away. He had 17 acres, and they gave him $1 million for 17 acres to build townhouses on. Now, when you're 75 years old or something, and somebody offers you $1 million for 17 acres, that's very hard to turn down. I don't care who you are or what you are. And that's the realities of today. I mean, you see these big tracts of ground for sale. I mean, developers are willing to offer you outrageous amounts of money because they know that the end product of building townhouses is an outrageously profitable business as well. So they can offer you $10,000, $20,000 an acre for farmland that you can't pay $4,000 or $5,000 an acre for and farm and make any money at it. But that's the dynamic we're caught at in a lot of our areas surrounding our larger communities. I mean, I'm only a half hour from downtown Pittsburgh. I mean, so we have a lot of commuter people living in Cranberry Township, which is just a mile and a half down the road from me, but they have 79 and 279 from Cranberry Township to downtown Pittsburgh is 20, 25 minutes at max. So they're moving out, and people aren't afraid to drive. I mean, we have people with 79. People are living in Mercer County, which is 45 minutes from downtown Pittsburgh, but it's 79 and 279, a straight shot into Pittsburgh. They're willing to do that to get out of the city and to have, live in the country somewhat. But then you have that whole dynamic. It falls into places. They come to the country, then, oh my gosh, you have cows, you spread manure. That manure stinks. Why are you doing that, I mean, that's the whole dynamic you face with that whole situation as well, is that's the next dynamic you have is that problem coming down the road because some developers, a great idea to build a little, 20-house development off some ground someplace in Mercer County, but obviously they don't realize that there's 20 other farms surrounding them in Mercer County that all spread manure, I mean, and there's the next problem you have, and we all know how that goes down the road too. So, yeah, it's an issue. I mean, but we can, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but thank you. Yeah.
And our last question, Representative Gillen.
It could be conceivably even yes or no answers, but when I'm listening to this discussion, I had to step out for a few moments, that the stress and the symptoms that dairy is under in Pennsylvania, when I read about Michigan, for example, they lack some processing capacity. New York has its own set of problems with depressed prices and demand. So in terms of marketing to milk deficit regions in the world. Now, I heard Pacific Rim, Mexico, but if you look at Latin America, there's a place of demand, and they don't have the capacity like we do to produce, or the Middle East, or Africa, or similar regions. In terms of potential growth markets there, do you see that as a positive and something that we ought to be going after?
Most definitely. I think any place, anytime you can sell a gallon of milk anywhere, you ought to be trying to sell it, or a pound of cheese or whatever. I mean, unfortunately, dairy farmers are their own worst enemies, because over the course of time, we've gone from the dairy cows that produce 10,000 pounds of milk to an average cow milk 20 or 25,000 pounds of milk, and we haven't had the capacity on the other end to be able to either process that milk or have a place to sell that milk. So over the course of my lifetime, I mean, when we started milking cows, our cows probably averaged maybe 12,000 pounds a year. When we were done, we were up over 20,000 pounds a year. And some of these huger farms that they can get up to 25,000 pounds a year per cow, that's a lot of milk production. And without a place to sell it, that's sort of kind of why we're in the crunch and how we got to the crunch we're in, I think. And I think the Secretary would agree with me on that. We are our own worst enemy in the fact that we can produce more milk than we have people to sell it to and places to process it. So I don't know. I don't know. Secretary, can you answer your question?
I thought I'd close with an easy question. Where is plant 42-040 located?
That's a question for the Milk Marketing Board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Someone from Turkey Hill.
Thank you very much to the members for all their questions and comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. You having the opportunity to be here and speak with you. Hope I answered some of your questions, made some clarity for you, but I have to run, like I said. So thank you very much, and we'll
thank you, Senator Vogel. Thank you to Senator Vogel for being here with us today and for the information presented. And I think Chairman Paszynski thought that we were all thirsty. So
Let me tell you what, John Lawrence can't be the only one drinking milk at this board meeting. I want to make sure everybody has a container of milk, and let's do a drink to the milk industry. Here, here, 3 cheers.
Thank you.
There you go, Mr. Chairman. That's good, and that's healthy too. Healthy, make it strong like bull.
thank you, Chairman Paszynski. Our next presenter is Jane Seabright, the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Center for Dairy Excellence. Welcome, Jane, and we look forward to your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Good afternoon. It's been a long week already. So, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present today. In addition to my role as a director at the center, I also wanted to mention that my husband and I milk 60 cows in East Berlin, Adams County. We have been dairy farming since 2005 when we took the cows. Actually, we purchased our own herd. His father and him farmed since 1992 together, and the farm's been in the family since 1866. Fortunately for us, dairy is only part of our farming operation. We also have 825 acres of cropland, and we sell a significant amount of our crops for grain. Our operation is diversified with the crop sales and with my off-farm income, and still there are months, like this one in particular, that it is very difficult to pay our bills. The only reason I am telling you this is because I want you to know that when you hear about the challenges that dairy farms face, they are very real, and they affect not only our farms, but the families that have invested a life's work into what they do. There is a significant amount of pain right now in the industry. Many people, both within our industry and outside of our industry, are deeply concerned about the well-being of our farms and the families that operate them. These family farms are sitting around the table right now making difficult decisions, ones that could tragically alter the course of a multi-generational business that has been in our state for hundreds of years. But the reality at the end of the day is that we are small business owners, and as a result, we assume part of that risk. We live in a free market society, and for any small business, or any business in particular, to stay in business, it must be able to compete. Being a farmer today requires careful thought, planning, and continually challenging yourself to find ways to improve in every aspect of your business. Sometimes even that isn't enough. Government policy cannot assure our survival. The best thing that it can do is encourage a market for our industry and market access for our farms, while providing the resources and support to help our farm families help themselves. Today, I'm going to provide you with some of the background on what is going on in the dairy industry right now and help you frame up the situation, and then Andy will take it from there with the findings of the dairy study. So actually, we did slides, so you can follow along. I don't have written testimony. I actually have slides that review each aspect of what I'm going to talk to. First of all, I want to talk about dairy's contribution to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a national leader in our dairy industry. We have the second largest number of dairy farms at 6,570 farms. And that's actually the 2017 number. It actually fell 80 farms last year, which surprises me. I actually thought that it would fall a lot more, but the USDA data came out last week and we only lost 80 farms. We have 525,000 head of dairy cows, and we're the 7th largest industry in the nation in terms of total milk production. We are leaders in butter, ice cream, and Swiss cheese. What's dairy worth to Pennsylvania? So why should a consumer care about dairy other than the dairy products that they enjoy? It produces valuable economic revenue, and these numbers are actually from Dr. Novakovic's dairy study. He's not going to go over them, so I included them in mine. Their study actually found that dairy was worth $14.7 billion in annual economic revenue, and it supported 52,000 jobs across the Commonwealth. We also provide wide open spaces and conservation of our natural resources. Those farms that turn into development, those wide open spaces are gone. Water filtration does not work as well, and just the beautiful scenes that you see in these dairy farms are gone. In some cases, dairy farms also provide tourism opportunities. That's only in certain part of the state, but certainly they're an attraction to bring you to those areas. Pennsylvania communities export milk and they import money. Dairy products are moved up and down the eastern seaboard and are exported out of the country. And those farmers sell their milk off their farm and they bring money back into their communities. Farms support highly competitive jobs with wages averaging between $14.33 and $25. And actually, back to the bring money to local community, dairy farmers actually spend about 85% of their income that they get from their farms, from the milk that they produce within their local communities or within a 50-mile radius. So the landscape of Pennsylvania's dairy farms. Our milk shed is growing. We hear a lot about dairy farmers struggling, but we are actually still growing as a state. In fact, in January, the numbers just came out, and we were actually up 1.4%. We are at our highest level since 2000. And for any of you who don't know, we peaked in 2000 at 11 billion pounds, and within a 4-year period, we fell to below 10 billion pounds. So in 2004, we reached a very low point, and since then, we've been steadily growing. But the last 2 years, we've actually been up about 1 to 2% each year. We're still falling behind nationally, though. About 3 or 4 years ago, we actually were number 5th. I'm not sure how far back we were number 4th, but we actually fell behind Michigan and Texas, both in 2017, falling to 7th. And it's not because we're shrinking, it's because they're growing so quickly. Our milk production, though, our milk production growth has all been from production per cow. Our production per cow, we've actually haven't changed cow numbers for 3 years, and prior to that, we lost 5,000 cows. So actually, all of our production growth is in milk production per cow. However, when you look at the other key leading dairy states, you can see that we're actually much slower in gaining milk production per cow. You look at Michigan, and they're actually up 36% in the same time where we only grew 13%. We have a changing demographic of our Pennsylvania dairy farms. Our herd is shrinking. Our milk production is improving, but we're still 200 pounds below the national average, and our herd size is actually growing. If you look at the data, this year we were about 80 cows per farm, and it didn't take long ago that we were only at around 69. However, we're still 100 cows below the national average. And actually, that's why we're second in the nation in terms of dairy farms, because our farms are smaller and there's more of them. When we look at the proportion in herd size, and it just compares us to other states, we have much fewer cows, or much fewer farms over 500 cows, and many more farms between 50 and 99. So that's just a little bit about who we are as a dairy farm population. Some of the challenges of our dairy farms: we have an aging farm ownership. So many of our owners are over 55 of age. They're generational businesses, and actually the farms aren't transferring quickly enough. And unfortunately, at the end, it becomes very difficult to transfer them because they didn't have a succession plan, they didn't invest in the operation, and at the end, it's just too costly to transfer that business. Farms are also faced with very diverse challenges. They have strict environmental pressures. Jeff's going to talk to you a little bit about some of those. We have high land values. In Lancaster County, you can pay $21,000 an acre for land, which it makes it very difficult to run a dairy farm. We have great access to our market. In fact, 60% of our population is within a day's drive of us, but that also means we have greater access for consumers. Consumers want to know that when they drive by our farms, that's the image they have of the dairy industry. So we need to make sure that our farm gates make people want to drink milk. And we have a significantly higher cost of production. So someone mentioned earlier today that our small farms have higher cost of production. And actually, I would tell you that there's a range in cost of production. Our cost of production is higher in Pennsylvania than in the nation. It's actually almost $2 higher, but there's a wide range. If you actually gathered data of all the Pennsylvania dairy farms, you would see farms that are making milk for under $14 a hundredweight, and you would see ones that can't make milk for less than $28 a hundredweight. And that's not just a factor of being small or large. We actually have small farms that are down in the $14 range, and we have large farms that are at the 26 or probably not 26, but $22 range. And it's really a function of their business structure, their debt, and their management. So when you look at whether or not our dairy farms are growing, we actually did a survey. The Center for Dairy Excellence does a survey of producers every 5 years. And in terms of cow numbers from 2012 to 2017, you can see we really didn't add a lot of cows, didn't add a lot of heifers, but we did add a good bit of milk. We added 2,000 pounds per day in milk. Another area where we see a lot of improvement in Pennsylvania is somatic cells. That's a measurement of milk quality. So you want the lowest amount of somatic cells possible when you sell that milk to the market, and actually 100 to 150,000 is very good. So we have a state, as a state, we have excellent milk quality. The other thing that's concerning about this dairy study is when you look at the primary operator's year of birth, that actually means that not only are they not getting any younger, they're actually getting older, because the age is actually the same from 5 years ago to now. Another key area that concerns us when we look at Pennsylvania dairy farms, and we looked at that dairy study, is the use of consultants and the use of the resources that are around them. When you look at this, only about 60% of our farms are using a financial consultant. I said earlier, a dairy farm is a small business. It has to be operated as such. And having those resources around the farm are critical to helping them make those business decisions that allow them to further their operation. Are you using a professional feed nutritionist? This is actually higher at 90%, but I would tell you that all dairy farmers need to be working with a nutritionist. The way that we're maximizing milk production in the country now is because that every bite that cow eats is perfectly balanced for that cow's diet. So, they actually eat a better balanced diet than we do. So a nutritionist actually takes the feeds on your farm and balances that diet to meet her exact nutrient needs. When you're not working with a nutritionist, you tend to just feed corn silage, hay, and top dress with grain. You have no idea whether or not that cow is getting the best diet possible, and you're leaving essentially some milk production on the table by not using a nutritionist. Systematic breeding program. AI has been around since the 1960s, and yet only 60% of our farms are using it. Or actually, that's timed AI, so that's a little bit different, but still there's room for improvement there. Written business plan. How many of you would say if you were a small business you should have a written business plan? All of you, right? And only 16% of our farms have a business plan. Formalized transition plan. Again, only 14% of our farms have a formalized transition plan. And this is the stuff at the center that really makes us worried. You know, when we look at our farms, the more we can do to give these farms these resources, the more the critical it is. Have you used crop insurance? Only 23% use crop insurance. So that means if they have a drought, they lose everything. And just to put that in perspective, in 2016, our farm had a drought. We lost, if you just looked at our crop income, we did not make enough money to cover our fertilizer bill, let alone all of our other bills that year. If we wouldn't have had crop insurance, it probably would have taken us out. It still wasn't very good, but that crop insurance allowed us to keep going. And it really concerns us that farms aren't using crop insurance. Another thing they're not using is risk management. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about risk management, but our farms just haven't acclimated to risk management yet. And then nutrient management plan, and this is something that's actually dictated by law. You're supposed to have a nutrient management plan or a manure management plan on your farm, and yet only 75% of our farms do. So this is another statistic that we pulled out from the Dairy Producer Survey, and it just talks about, we asked the farms, what is the most limiting factor to growing your dairy operation? And you can see from 2017, from 2012, milk price or quota skyrocketed. And actually, 2012 and 2017 were pretty comparable price years. However, there's one thing that changed. There's more base systems, quota systems, more cooperatives are requiring their farms to stay within a certain amount of production. So that's basically why that's a little higher. The two that really skyrocketed are excess debt and land availability. You can see that land is in a shortfall. It's very expensive. And Dr. Novakovic is going to talk about this. A lot of farms are struggling with excess debt. The last one, though, is probably the biggest. Our farms have no desire to expand. They're perfectly happy milking cows at 60 or 80 or 100 cows. And that's fine. But if you're going to milk 60 or 80 cows, you have to figure out ways to diversify your income, find a niche market, or figure out a way so that you can compete with larger farm operations that can have more efficiencies of scale. Another thing I wanted to cover is changes in the marketplace. And I heard earlier today we're operating in a global marketplace, and that's true. About 14% of our milk solids in the country were exported in 2017. That's actually down from a peak of 17% in 2014. There's a lot of global pressures that are affecting the mailbox price that dairy farmers are receiving in Pennsylvania. Somebody mentioned Europe. There's a huge amount of powder supplies sitting in storage in Europe waiting to enter the marketplace. If they enter the marketplace the wrong way, they will cripple our industry. And that's a concern that a lot of people in the industry have weighing on them right now. And then when you look at worldwide dairy regions, they're all growing. U.S., we're actually growing. You hear a lot about low milk prices, but we're still growing in milk production. In the Northeast, there's a lot of changes that are affecting our prices. Class 1 or drinking milk. So milk is priced in four classes: Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, and Class 4. Class 1 you get the most money for. It's the class that goes into drinking milk. It's what you're drinking right now. Those sales have been declining. I think last year they were down about 1.6%. They've led to plant plant closures and also at plants not operating at capacity. Class 2, or yogurt production, it's actually declined a little bit in the Northeast. It's still strong, but in 2014 you heard a lot about the yogurt boom, and that's actually tapered off a little bit. There's limited demand and underutilized plant capacity in the Class 1 category, and that's resulting in older Class 1 plants. We have a lot of old facilities in the state, and honestly, if you ask those processors why they haven't modernized their facilities, they will say the margins aren't good enough for them to invest in their plants. We have a lot more milk going into Class 3 and Class 4, actually a lot more milk going into Class 4 into butter powder plants, and they're essentially balancing plants. That milk is priced the lowest, and it goes in there when it can't go anywhere else. So what is the changing utilization done to our dairy farmers? It's basically shrank the basis between the mailbox price and the Class 3 price. Like I said earlier, you receive the most money from Class 1 sales. So in 2000, when they were receiving when 44% of our milk was going into Class 1, we received a lot more money. There was a much larger premium for milk in Northeast than there was across the country. However, as our processing needs have changed, that price has gone down. Furthermore, our changing processing needs have caused short-term balancing challenges. So we need less milk for Class 1 sales in this region. So that milk then is going into other types of processing, and in some cases, which Andy can talk more about, it's actually going out of our state into Wisconsin or Michigan, and farmers are paying the cost to transport that milk into those other plants where it can be processed into other products, because we don't have that processing here. And really the biggest thing that we're seeing that's really the first time ever is that dairy producers in some cases can't find a market. So if you have a new farmer, actually in 2005 when we started milking cows, they had actually stopped milking cows on our farm for about 7 years. So in 2005 we had four different milk markets visit our farm to try and get our business. Right now, you wouldn't have any milk markets visit your farm. Nobody is taking new members, and nobody is allowing a lot of additional product to come into their market. It's just such a tight scenario right now. In some cases, we even have producers losing their markets. It's just very challenging out there right now. Again, the stress in the margin, you can see this graph actually illustrates that. You can see the tightening up at the end between the Pennsylvania and U.S. average milk price. And again, this just reiterates what I said earlier. Dairy farmers in Pennsylvania have historically had a much higher basis and a much higher price than in almost every region of the U.S. However, in the last 5 years, that's really eroded. It's actually gone down about $1 on most farms. And on an average dairy farm with 70 cows producing 70 pounds per day, that's about a $20,000 loss annually. So just that dollar loss in product results in a $20,000 loss on that farm each year. This is another way to look at it. Currently, the mailbox price is well under the average break-even. So we just got our advance price for February 2018. It was $14.03. That's about 80% of what they expect the settlement to be. So if we estimate that the February price will be about $15.41, you can see that that's well below break-even. And if you take that price compared to the break-even price, the average farm will lose about $4,700 in February alone. So how are farmers managing this risk? Recent changes to the Dairy Margin Protection Program improve its effectiveness, but it's still minimal catastrophic coverage. It's not really a true farm safety net. We are encouraging at the center our farms to look at the program, but it's just catastrophic. It will not save any dairy farm. Other risk management programs are available. There's actually some really good ones. Through a lot of cooperatives offer contracting opportunities. You can contract your milk through a broker, or you can use the LGM for Dairy insurance program. That's actually another federal insurance program, but only a very few number of producers actually use those programs. Many farms rely on credit lines, cash reserves, or drawing down equity to cover these losses. And at some point, those options run out. So to summarize what I just covered, what's dairy worth? It's a major contributor in terms of quality products, good jobs, valuable economic revenue, and wide open spaces. What's it look like? Our dairy farms are generational businesses, traditionally smaller than the average across the U.S., with higher costs of production. What's the challenge? Dairy farm families must become competitive. We have to lower our cost of production. That doesn't mean we have to expand, but it does mean we have to look at diversity, we have to look at niche markets. And we're slow to utilize the resources that we have available to us. What's happening in the market? Pennsylvania is competing on a global marketplace. That's not going to change. The Northeast region is currently oversupplied. Traditionally a fluid milk state, Pennsylvania milk is now moving into other classes, which is lowering the basis, or the difference between the milk price that we receive and the national average. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. What a tremendous amount of information. And I know the committee members will have an opportunity to review that information. But are there questions at this time for Jane? We'll start with Representative Keller and then come to Representative Ryan.
Not really a question, but more of a plug for the Center for Dairy Excellence. As a director, board member that sits on the board of Center for Dairy Excellence, those of us that are still here that have dairy farms in their districts, please share with them that this is a wealth of opportunity and information that can be shared with them and help them through some of these difficult times in setting up the transition and knowing a business plan. It's all pieces of the puzzle that the Center for Dairy Excellence actually supports and can actually, there are some grants for through the center to help in the dairy industry. So take advantage of it. Send the word out, because a lot of times the farmers don't understand, and as Jane alluded to, they don't have a business plan, or they don't have a know how to the transition to do, and those type of things. So it's an opportunity and it's a resource for them. So just a plug for the center.
Representative Ryan.
Jane, this has been incredibly helpful, and Secretary Redding, as usual, it's always great to hear from you. And it really is a question for both. I specialize in keeping companies out of bankruptcy. I'm a CPA. I had one dairy client in 1985. I've gotten 47 phone calls since January. And so we're starting to meet with a group of farmers together, and I'm from Fairfield, so your neck of the woods. My question becomes this, is that George Wolf has been advising me, and I've been working with George for the past couple of years about federal milk market pricing. And in the years of doing economic warfare in the Marine Corps, I'm wondering if the milk marketing pricing in the Commonwealth that we've had has inadvertently, due to its complexity with classes 1 through 4, created an environment where there's an economic destabilization affecting us because of outsized forces that are not influenced by those same milk marketing issues. As we tried to decipher it, and I've sat down with Betsy Albright and others and tried to decipher the different issues, and I asked a group of farmers, I said, do you know that you're getting paid properly? Virtually every one of them started laughing and said, Frank, no one knows if this is being done properly. It's that complex. So the question I have for you really relates to is are we falling victim a little bit to the fact that we were a controlled market, or are we now being adversely affected by forces outside of the control of the dairy farmer, where they are now truly being victimized by it? But I can tell you, I've looked at the numbers of the folks that have contacted me. They've got between 90 and 120 days before it's too late. And you'll start to see a record number of bankruptcies. When I've seen this in other nations, when this has happened, once they've gone bankrupt, you don't get that capacity back ever again. I've been dealing with the restructure of Haiti for the poultry industry now for 20 years. And so this, in my mind, is probably the greatest crisis we have in the Commonwealth with affecting the dairy industry. So I would ask you is, what's your take on what's triggering this pricing concern and the adverse implications it's having on our dairy farmers?
So actually, the 4 classes of milk is not unique to Pennsylvania. It's nationwide. And we have class 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's actually, there's been some debate whether we should have less or more classes in the United States. But really, what's going on right now is in 2014, we saw record high milk prices. And that stimulated a growth in milk supply across the world, across the country, and in some cases, there's dairies in other parts of the United States that are adding 10,000 cows at a time, and who can produce milk for $14 a hundredweight, and right now they're still profitable. So that's some of what's going on. It's really the law of supply and demand, and right now we have an oversupply. There's debate over whether the classes help or hurt, but I don't think what we're in right now is due to an antiquated pricing structure. And actually, Dr. Novakovic could probably answer that question better. But he's not listening.
The only thing I would add, I think the part of the installment in our dairy study gets at this issue of the influence of the Milk Marketing Board on pricing. And I would just say that is a piece of to come that I think answers in part, Representative, your question. Yeah.
Representative. Wait until he gets to the presentation. It just that when Jane was hitting those items, it was fascinating issue. There is as you can only imagine, when you have 47 farmers together, you're going to get multiple diverse opinions. But I've worked with the groups in Maryland, and they seem to have a different pricing pressure. Frederick, Maryland, as an example, is experiencing different issues. Washington County, Maryland, different issues, and I can't figure it out what's triggering the differences. So that's why I would love to get together with you and talk to you about it afterwards.
Yeah, I would say every farm's going to be a little unique in the situation that they're going through. Really, I think most milk marketers would tell you that our state pricing system really influences the surrounding area. So the premiums that we're going to see are pretty similar to the premiums that they're going to see outside the state. The biggest thing is right now, 5 years ago, we would have gotten $2.50 over whatever the national milk price was, which allowed us to compete on a little more even playing field. And now that's lower. It's like $1.50, which makes it more difficult to compete.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good question. I think very appropriate for the next presentation also.
Great, thanks.
So, thank you, Representative Ryan. Representative Mao.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jane, thank you. It's very informative. I'm a fellow Adams Countyan. What I think I just heard is we, the little mom and pop shops, are trying to keep up with the big Walmarts out west. And I've never seen it happen that the little mom and pop shops uptown can sell competitively as Walmart does. So we got to figure out how to outsmart Walmart.
Exactly.
Okay, so at least that's the way I'm seeing the crux of the problem here. It's not a marketing board. It's not, you can't point your finger at one thing except supply and demand. Okay, and they're supplying it at a much lower cost than what we can because they're, I actually, not for anything, was privileged to take a trip out west not too awful long ago in the fall and saw 6 gigantic combines going side by side down through a field that was miles long with tractor trailers following them. I'm thinking, how can we ever compete on 100-acre farms with something like that? And it sounds like we're talking about basically the same thing. But have we ever, and maybe we do, have we ever decided to venture into organics here? I know it was an up-and-coming thing. Is that a niche that we could go to?
We actually do have several farms in Pennsylvania. We have a strong organic presence in Pennsylvania on dairy farms. Unfortunately, right now that market is also flooded. So last I heard, the organic market in this area has a 3-year waiting list. They're not taking any new farms until 2020. The oversupply is really, it's across the industry, whatever niche you look at, though.
And PA Preferred is something we're already doing as well?
Yeah, and we've actually, Secretary Redding's team talked about, having some farms, actually having dairy farmers become members of PA Preferred. So that's certainly a program that has room to grow in the dairy category.
How has RBST affected, or does it affect you guys?
RBST was a technology that allowed dairy farms to, even like the misconception was it helped large dairy farms, but it actually helped all dairy farms. We used it on our dairy. It allowed us to produce more milk and ship more volume. Although since that technology has been taken away, farms have adapted by improving other areas of their business. They improved reproduction, they improved overall management, so that, right, I just said, we're still growing in milk production even though RBST is off the market.
I wasn't aware of that. So RBST is no longer available to dairy farmers.
Yeah, so actually,
Didn't know.
in Pennsylvania, no farms, there might be a few up in the very northern part, but I don't think any farms are using it anymore.
What about out west? That's not national forbidden product?
You can buy it, but you can't sell the milk. People don't want the milk.
No markets are taking the milk.
With RBST?
Well, in the Northeast, other places, yes.
So they can increase their production in the Midwest 100,000 cows at a time with RBST, but we can't?
Actually, the state I was referring to can't use RBST either. It's Michigan. They're not using RBS. They're not, as far as I understand, they're not allowed to use it either.
Okay, so we got to figure out what will increase the demand side of the equation, because obviously the supply side is more than there. So is milk being taught that it's healthy once again? When I was a kid in school, which was probably way before your time, it was one of the necessary food groups. Are we still teaching that?
Probably.
But are we still teaching that?
So actually, there's new research that actually shows that dairy fats, whole milk, and butter are actually good again. There actually research is showing that the dairy fats are very good for your overall health. And if you look in the trends in sales right now, that research is actually catching on. Whole milk was actually the only category out of the fluid milk category to grow last year. Skim 2% and 1% were all down, but whole actually increased in milk consumption. And then butter has been growing year after year because of that. So in the schools, the 1%, adding that back in was really beneficial. I would encourage any legislator to do whatever they can to get whole milk back in the schools, but the 1% certainly helped. But as a nation, there is more research showing the benefits of dairy fats.
So you think we'll go back into a trend where all of the nutrition specialists are once again going to say, oh, it's okay to drink milk, milk's kind of good for you, and there for a while they were pushing you away from it because of the fat that's in it?
I hope so. I can't tell you.
All right, thank you, Jane, appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next is Representative Fee. If we could be brief and concise so that we could stay on. That wasn't directed.
I'm always brief. You picked the right
that
representative.
That wasn't directed to Representative Fee.
That's the one you got to tell, not this one.
It was the prior speaker.
So, and I'm not sure you can even answer my question, but, with EPA and DEP coming down with the regulations on our farms, especially in Lancaster County, and I see Brenda's here from the conservation districts. I know our conservation districts are out on many of the small farms right now, making sure they have their plans in place. But is there an effort to make sure, as I look at your checklist here of all the different management things that would help our farmers survive, Are there people out there reviewing that with them? I mean, I would think that would be a great opportunity, as our conservation folks are on the farm, to not only, look at the management plan, but to review all the things that you outline to help make them a success.
So, I mean, we share our resources with the cooperative field representative, the feed nutritionist. They are the ones that are really the first line of people working with those farms, and they're encouraged to share all those resources. Anytime we have a farm sign up for a program, any of our programs, we walk through all those steps. We want them to have a a manure management plan, an AE/NS plan. We want them to have a business plan and know their cost of production. I would say on the flip side, when conservation districts go out, they want to know that farm's doing everything to be successful. So I think, especially given the current state, there's more of an effort to make sure that those farms are aware of all the resources they have.
That's great. I mean, it'll be a great source, especially with, our Amish farms and the smaller farms that may not get the message. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Fee. Representative Zimmerman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Jane, for all your good work. Jane, we spend state monies to preserve farms, and I'm a big believer in saving good farmland. At the same time, this idea of saving the farmer, not sure what that looks like. If we save our farms and don't have farmers at some point, what does that look like? And so I say that with this question, and that is, at the center, with all you do, where are you spending most of your time and resources and energy right now? What would your response be to that?
So right now, our flagship programs continue to be our on-farm resources, helping farms, putting consulting resources around those farms to help them make the best decisions they can possible, looking at all their options. We have 4 grants. We have a grant that actually covers the cost of a consultant to look at their finances, look at their whole farm operation, and tell them. And in some cases, that has to include an exit strategy out of dairy. And how do you do that while preserving your farm, preserving your equity, and doing it in the best way possible? In some cases, it's looking at, is it diversity or whatever it is. But those programs right now are in very high demand. We also do a lot of other stuff, but that continues to be the flagship of what we do.
Okay. So in reality, you are doing what you can to help save the farmer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would every time we're out in the industry, I tell the farms these programs are there for them to use or lose. So I would say we only had 180 farms sign up. And once you use our programs, our goal is to get you to the point where you don't need them anymore. You're doing it on your own. So we've helped over 1,400 farms since our existence. But last year we had 160 or 70 farms that used our programs when there probably should have been 1,000. Mm-hmm. Now, if there were 1,000, I don't know that I'd have enough money to help them all. But the farms are not stepping up enough to get the help they need to work through this.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Can I add on to that just a little bit?
Representative Keller.
Jane's, if I can, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Proceed.
The center also is in the classroom, and we feel it's very important that we educate our youth in about the dairy industry. So there's a component there also. So just wanted you to know that.
Thank you, Representative Keller. Representative Diamond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Keep it short.
Thank you. Am I done? Am I done now? No. Thank you, Jane, for coming in. As you were talking about the various costs of production, and I know it's a wide range and a lot of factors go into that, and in your conclusion you talked about the need to get farmers to reduce their production costs. What came into my mind was a chicken operation in my county, which is absolutely world-class. They're really not concerned with that cost so much because their theory down there is we sell the most expensive chicken in the world and we can't make enough of it. because there is a market for high-quality products, and they're well known for those high-quality products. And so, and they're expanding, like beat the band out there. So then I look at this milk container that was brought to us, and I see that it is a well-known Pennsylvania company whose name is on it. It's distributed by, that company in Conestoga, and it says processed and packaged in a certain number plant. I don't know where that plant is, but I guess the question is, I don't see anything on here that says this is Pennsylvania milk. Is this Pennsylvania milk? And why, if it is it not being advertised as Pennsylvania milk? Because if we're going to produce, is there room in the milk industry to say, this milk is fantastically awesome and it's the most expensive milk in the world and we can't make enough of it? Is there room in Pennsylvania's market to do that? Or is our milk processing, collection, distribution, is it just so homogenized that we just cannot have one place that's identifying itself as the most expensive milk in the world, and we're doing great, we're growing by leaps and bounds, and we can't sell enough of it? Is this market just not conducive to that?
First of all, I'm not actually sure this is Pennsylvania milk.
Okay. And that's a problem to begin with.
There was some changes at Turkey Hill, so...
Yeah.
Carrie's actually
I didn't want to say the brand name.
While we were sitting here, Carrie researched where that code comes back to.
Okay.
And I'll let her.
It's bottled at the Rutter's plant in York.
In York.
So it is mostly Pennsylvania milk.
It's mostly Pennsylvania milk.
Yeah, Rutter's is mostly Pennsylvania.
It's mostly 60% or 90% or 99%. I didn't want to drop any brand names or bust anybody here.
I'm not really
but,
sure.
I mean, that's a problem to me, is that this is not identified as the awesome milk that we make here in Pennsylvania.
So we continue to encourage processors to use their labels to talk about local product. That's actually a hallmark of what PA Preferred is about, encouraging them to market their milk as from local farms. You'll actually see in some of the grocery stores, they're actually doing that. You'll see billboards that talk about, above the dairy case, that talk about local milk, straight from Pennsylvania farms. There's a lot of that going on. If you really want to control your milk price, though, the best thing you can do is sell it direct. I have a dairy a mile up the road from me, started a home delivery business 7 or 8 years ago. They're doing really well. They have 4 trucks in the road. There's restaurants and stores you go to here that you can buy Apple Valley Creamery milk. Now, I would tell you, you can buy milk at the store that's just as good as that, but they've found a niche, and they're benefiting from it.
So entering into a niche like that for a dairy farmer, is that more profitable than actually selling to, some other processor?
I'd actually have to look, they're controlling their price. So when the price goes down to $14, they control their price. They're vertically integrated, so they're still getting what they need to cover their cost of production.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much, Jane. We appreciate the information, and we'll continue to review what you've provided for us. Thank you. Our next presenter is Dr. Andrew Novakovich. I hope I pronounced that right. Professor of Agricultural Economics at Cornell University. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much.
You may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. It is my goal to not read all these slides to you. I may go over them kind of quickly. You'll find that a bunch of them are pretty complementary to what Jane did, and I don't want to beat that to death, and I'm really much more interested in seeing if I can make myself available to respond to some of your questions. Let me just say a couple things in advance. One, when Secretary Redding and Jane first approached us about doing this study, I have to confess my mind was telling me things like just say no, and you've got plenty on your plate. But I just want to have a little bit of a shout out to the Secretary and Jane and Alan. The dairy industry is full of really great people, and those are at least 3 of them right there. And I very much respect the sincerity and the dedication that they all have brought to this project. I know it's a frustration for all elected officials to try to do good things for folks and finding it a lot harder than they would like. And that's true around this table, and it's also true of the people that I've been working with. The other thing that I want to say is I grew up in the state of Wisconsin. My family was in the dairy business and also in cheese making. I've spent my entire career at Cornell University, and none of that has anything to do with Pennsylvania, other than I've been a neighbor and paid attention to your industry for a while. I am very wary of riding in my 12-year-old pickup truck and coming across as a guy who's got all the answers to your questions, and I try very hard to not present myself as that way. On the other hand, I've spent my entire life trying to be able to answer questions about dairy, so shame on me if I don't have a few. But I'm not here to tell you what to do, but I will try to be responsive and share with you what I think I know about this industry that we're all part of. Chuck and Mark and I were sort of commissioned to do this study. We dragged in a friend of ours from Michigan State with whom Mark and I have been working for the last 5 years on farm financial analysis. So Chris Wolf participated in that part of this study. And one of the things that we thought was particularly interesting or worthwhile to do is to try to compare Pennsylvania to these other major Great Lakes dairy states. It's sort of interesting to know what's going on in Texas and Idaho and California, but that's probably not super relevant to what we can do here, but maybe having some insights from other states that are nearby and also major states could be helpful. The other thing that I want to be careful to say is my hope is to help you all think strategically about your industry, the industry that we're all interested in. It has not been our intent or plan to write the strategic plan for this industry. As I've said many times, it would be incredibly presumptive for me to imagine I could write a strategic plan for 5,000, 6,000 individual businesses. But perhaps we can help you think about what sort of strategic plans each of those dairy farms and dairy processors want to develop for themselves, and maybe help you think about how the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania can participate in that. One of my messages also is to recognize that we talk about farmers, we're motivated by farmers, we're concerned about the trajectory of our dairy farmers, but this is an industry that represents a supply chain that starts with farmers and actually even before them when you think about credit and feed and seed and all that, and goes all the way to the consumer. And there are folks that you represent that don't live on farms. There are folks important to the Commonwealth that live in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Scranton and Wilkes-Barre and Harrisburg and everywhere in between that in their own way are part of this dairy industry. And we need to think about that as a system. We talked about processing in our study because, of course, what's the point of having a dairy farm if you don't have a customer? And that customer has to have a customer and so on down the line until you end up with consumers. Thinking about that overall system is important. Again, I don't want to belabor statistics, but I'll share a couple with you and make just a few comments. The basic story in this general market trends section is, as Jane noted, Pennsylvania is a large and important milk-producing state, but it has become less so than it was historically. When I started in my career at Cornell, which is 40 years ago now, Pennsylvania was not the largest milk-producing state, but it was one of the best. It had impressive credentials in terms of its productivity. It had successful farms that looked well kept, that were reasonably profitable. It was growing. It had good products. It had a lot to brag about. That situation has changed rather considerably in the last 20 years or so. And of course, it's part of the reason why we're sitting here and asking these questions about what happened and what can we do. This chart shows production growth. I just want to use it to make a couple of points. If you look at the 1960s, you can see that all of these states pretty much had some difficulty in the 60s. I won't go into what that was all about, but the 60s were a tough time for dairy. We find, maybe not surprisingly, that tough times have a way of inspiring some people to get better. And in the case of New York, the 1960s were that period. We saw a pretty substantial transformation in the way New York dairy farmers conducted their business because of the difficulties of the 1960s. It was the beginning of what I would call a great entrepreneurial period in New York. Largely confined to the western part of the state, less so in the eastern part of the state, but it traces back to that time. If you move over to the 1990s and look at the red line, this was the period of being in the wilderness for the state of Wisconsin. It had the great shock of finding California surpassing it as a milk-producing state, which was almost a mortal blow to the psyche of the dairy farmers and indeed badgers throughout the state of Wisconsin. They were in the doldrums for over a decade and spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how to get out. And as you can see in the early 2000 period, they turned that ship around. I've shared this story with the other people working on this project a couple of times, but I think there are some lessons to be learned from the experience in Wisconsin that have some applicability to Pennsylvania. As Jane noted, Pennsylvania has the second largest number of dairy farmers after Wisconsin. Pennsylvania's got a lot less milk than the state of Wisconsin, and so this is a reminder that those two states share a profile that includes a lot of small-scale farms. Indeed, when I was growing up in the state, the small farm probably had 18 cows and the big farm probably had 32. That, of course, has shifted a bit, but there are still a lot of very small farms in the state of Wisconsin, as well as a larger number of bigger ones as well. So that was its period of diversity. Michigan may well be entering its period of adversity, but it's been doing quite well now for well over a decade, close to 20 years. I won't belabor the particulars of this presentation. If you're interested in talking about it some more, we can certainly do that. But let me move instead to a section that we did on farm financial performance. The general market trends come from data collected by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They're kind of a guess, but they're a really, really good guess. We have what I think are highly reliable statistical estimates for things like production per cow, numbers of cows. The number of herds information comes from licensing, so it doesn't get too much more accurate than that. It doesn't tell you about ownership, doesn't tell how many families own those farms, how many families own more than one farm, but it gives you a pretty good idea about licensed operations. When we look at farm financial performance, we're looking at data from farms that volunteered to open up their books and share them with somebody. In New York, we have a few hundred farms that participate in something we call our Dairy Farm Business Summary, where at the conclusion of a year, they share information with us about that previous year. That's pretty detailed. Physical characteristics, financial performance, balance sheet information. The state of Wisconsin, through the University of Wisconsin, has a rather similar business summary program, also has a few hundred farms that participate. State of Michigan, through Michigan State University, has a similar program, although a little bit more. They also provide monthly records, more of an accounting package, and less of a business summary, or limited to just a business summary package. Pennsylvania has something that, as you know, runs through your Pennsylvania Farm Bureau. We also have had access to some information from Ag Choice. My point is, you can't look at these data and say this is the average for any of these four states. It is a representation. It represents good ones, bad ones, small ones, big ones, but there is nothing about these data that allows us to say this is statistically representative of the entirety of the state. So we have to have a little bit of a grain of salt when we look at this. On the other hand, we wouldn't share them with you if we didn't think that they were instructive. Again, we also thought that it would be meaningful to make comparisons to these 4 Great Lakes states because, yeah, they're not all identical, but they're pretty similar in agricultural assets, quality of the land, nature of the climate. Marketing opportunities have some similarities. Wisconsin's a little farther west. You don't have the big East Coast states, but there are certainly large urban markets that Wisconsin focuses on in the Midwest, as well as moving product to other areas. Dairy farm structure, not identical, but certainly some similarities. When you look across these data, in general, the picture it portrays is a little bit lower levels of profitability, in this case measured by return on assets, but you could use other measures of profitability. For Pennsylvania farms, a little bit higher debt-to-asset ratios, a little bit lower current ratios, in other words, liquidity, on Pennsylvania farms. I wouldn't want to portray this as drastically different, but these major metrics that we look at to measure profitability, solvency, and liquidity often look just a little bit less well when we look at Pennsylvania farms. It's also, I think, particularly more pronounced when you look at the larger size herds. Michigan has some very large herds. New York has the largest herd size profile east of the Mississippi, with the exception of the state of Florida, which has very large farms in the central part of the state. Wisconsin has more farms over 1,000 cows than any other state in the country, including California. There are large farms everywhere, and in the main, these large-scale farms typically do very well no matter where they're located. The larger scale farms in Pennsylvania, which it's 500 and up, so we don't know how many of those are at 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000, but my guess is they're a little more located towards the 500 number. Don't stand out, don't pop out quite as successfully as some of the others. Return on assets, a measure of profitability. These large-scale farms in Pennsylvania do better than the Wisconsin average, but not as well as they do for the Michigan and New York average, and that's the average of all the farms. So this sort of thing gives us some pause. We've provided some graphs that show some of these sorts of performances mapped out by size of farm and performance level. I don't want to belabor that too much, but that was the basic finding in looking at these farm financial records, all my caveats before in mind. We also took advantage of some modeling tools that we've been working with for a long time. In fact, the original model that was developed along these lines was something I worked on when I was a graduate student at Purdue University in the 1970s. So this is a piece of work that we've been investing in, expanding, improving for a long period of time. And we found it useful for a variety of things. And we thought, well, let's take a look at what this thing might say in terms of plant capacity and the potential for plant investment in this part of the world. I want to preface our findings by saying, in some respects, this model is really complicated and sophisticated, and in other respects, it's ridiculously simple. Where it is complex is in its spatial detail. We have production, consumption, and processing basically modeled on a 2 or 3 county unit of observation. In some places where counties are big, it's literally one county. We also have an awful lot of detail by product type. We don't have every SKU in the grocery store, but we have a large number of product categories that allow us to not just say, should you have a cheese plant, but should you have a commodity-style cheese plant or should you have a specialty-style cheese plant? We know about yogurt. We don't just know about Class 2. And so this allows us to get fairly granular when it comes to type of plant and location. Where the model is ridiculously simple is it's driven by three costs. Cost of moving milk from farms to plants, cost of processing, and the cost of moving product from the plant to a city center or place of consumption. Think about it maybe as a grocery store location. We don't have home delivery, but we get it at least as far as major cities and other locations where people live. What that basically does is say, if you've got a bunch of milk here and you got a bunch of people that live there, what's the cheapest way to get the milk to the consumer through a processing plant that's going to turn it into a product? It doesn't know anything about taxes. It doesn't know anything about cost of land. It doesn't know anything about wage rates, although we can put in processing costs. So if you were thinking about an actual siting decision for building a plant, you would look at a lot of other things, but we think that the model result gives us a starting point, a way to say, is there a fundamental justification to think about new capacity in a certain place of a certain type? I would be the last to say, go to Reading, Pennsylvania and build that specialty cheese plant right now. But I would say it's worth thinking about whether or not this makes sense somewhere in Pennsylvania, because it looks like there's a cost justification for doing this. This particular chart also lets me make a second point. We've often been asked, hey, did you guys, how much time did you spend thinking about putting a plant in Pennsylvania? Honestly, it's entirely coincidental that this model wants to build plants in Pennsylvania. We didn't jigger it that way. We didn't do anything to make it come out that way. It could have come up in New York and you would all thought, oh yeah, well, sure, he's from Cornell. But it came up in Pennsylvania, and so you step back, I step back, and I say, why would that be? And I have two answers for that question. The first one is indicated on this slide. This is a little bit of a noisy slide. It's showing monthly volumes of farm milk used in Class 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the Northeast order. And what it basically is saying is we're going kind of downhill on fluid, we're going kind of uphill on Class 4, kind of not so clear what the slope is on Class 3, sort of level, and gaining a little altitude on Class 2. Doesn't really look too dramatic, but what I will say is the plants on the ground today weren't built yesterday based on what's going to be consumed tomorrow. They were built 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And we are in a marketplace that looks very different from 25 years ago. We are shedding capacity in fluid milk. We actually aren't using as much of our cheese capacity as we once did. And we're growing Class 4, which is okay, but Class 4 isn't like really the big money maker. Butter and non-fat dry milk. What this model is saying is the Northeast has got more investment in Class 1 than it needs. Not a big surprise given what's happening to Class 1. But you got lots of milk and you got lots of people, so what would be a better thing to do with that milk than to try to push it through a Class 1 plant that doesn't want it? And it's saying cheese. And it is saying a particular kind of cheese, which happens to be the cheese segment that now is growing most significantly. Also, it's a value-added cheese. Should the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the state of New York, you name it, on the Northeast, put a lot of energy in building a commodity cheese plant to chug out more pizza cheese, to chug out more cheese for cheeseburgers? My head says Yeah, not so much. Number one, the bloom is a little off the rose on cheeseburgers and pizza. That's not growing as fast as it once was. Still growing, but, you know, in the world of Chipotle and all that stuff, McDonald's, Burger King isn't doing as well. Pizza's still pretty strong, but there's lots of other choices there. So part of that's, where is that going to be 20 years from now? And the other thing is, do you really think we've got some big advantage over the Hillmar cheese plant in the Texas Panhandle that's bringing in 12 million pounds of milk a day, putting it on a railroad that goes in all four directions of the country, off to Seattle, off to LA, off to Boston, off to Miami? Do you really think that we're going to do a better job of that than those guys? And I would say, don't make that plan. On the other hand, if you're talking about smaller volume, high value added products, which people are really getting pretty excited about, okay, I can start to see where that could fit into a Northeast environment. Point number two, why Pennsylvania? Why not New York? If you look at changes in milk production in the Northeast, imagine that map, imagine a pivot, let's say on Philadelphia, kind of sweeping from Maine over this direction. That first arc heading towards central upstate New York is a part of the dairy industry that has a long, proud tradition and is in retreat, including Vermont. It's in retreat in Maine, it's in retreat in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey. Think about your own state. Where is the strongest part of milk production in your state? Where has it been declining? I would say that arm sweeping over through Philadelphia is hitting a part of your state that hasn't been increasing so much, has probably been declining more than other parts of the state. In that environment, New York is more and more required to move milk into Boston as well as New York City to replace what used to be a pretty large volume of milk in New England. That New York milk is called on in this model and by common sense to serve the fluid market more. It's, although not as big as it once was, it's still a huge part of the Northeast dairy industry, and that milk's got to come from someplace. Pennsylvania, in my view, becomes the swing state. There's going to be milk from Pennsylvania that goes over to New York City, certainly to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington for the fluid market. But it's got a lot of milk available, and there isn't a lot of milk south. So if you're looking for where can I tap into this northeastern reservoir to do more than just fluid milk, I think Pennsylvania stands out as a logical possibility. Not for the fluid milk part, but for other value-added opportunities that largely are going to be heading towards Atlanta, Raleigh, Miami, etc., not just Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. I'm going to skip all that stuff. Pennsylvania Milk Marketing Board. Jane told me I had to talk about the Pennsylvania Milk Marketing Board, so here you go. One slide. I know there's a lot of discussion. There's folks that are concerned about it. There are folks that are angry about it. There's folks that think that anger is entirely misplaced. We've got a section of the report which was largely written by Chuck Nicholson, which in his own way is very analytical. And in my own simple-minded Andy Novakovich way, my statement to you is the Pennsylvania Milk Marketing Board is not the cause of your problems, and it's not the solution to your problems. I think it's an astonishing distraction from what you should really be focusing on. I think there are things that one could say about this particular form of state regulation. Although Pennsylvania stands out in the complexity of this regulation today among the other 49 states, there were many states that had regulations of this type. There are a few states that actually still have something like this on the books but don't use it. This is a type of regulation that in the 1960s and 1970s was analyzed, researched, and talked about a great deal. And its performance, what it does, how it works, how does it impact the marketplace, is well researched. And frankly, when I look at what happens in Pennsylvania, I don't see anything surprising. I don't see anything remotely inconsistent with what we understood about this type of regulation going back 40 or 50 years. I think it is a type of regulation, particularly in a market where Class 1 is declining, and particularly when you recognize that a state can only regulate economic activity that occurs entirely within the state. It's a regulation that has a smallish number of people who benefit quite a bit, and everybody else kind of not really being harmed, not being a loser, but not benefiting particularly or as much. To me, whether or not this continues is entirely something that deserves to be debated in the Pennsylvania dairy industry and in Harrisburg, and I wish you luck with that conversation. Can Pennsylvania learn from other states? I think so. And I've oversimplified some of these learnings, just to keep it on one slide and not get too detailed, but I could certainly talk about it more than this. When I think about your neighbor to the north, I think one of the key things that stands out for me, and of course I've worked there now for 40 years, is there are some tremendous, amazing dairy industry entrepreneurs in the state of New York. Just jaw-droppingly good, always thinking ahead of the curve, doing some amazing things on their farm and beyond their farm. I think those people are inspiring. And if you've got some vision that, you know, these are some kind of like weird people that, you know, do funny things with their kids or whatever, these are dairy farmers just like everybody else. And good, solid people, thoughtful people, caring people, concerned about their workers, concerned about their animals, concerned about their industry. I think that entrepreneurial spirit is something that could be inspiring to anybody, anywhere. Michigan has enjoyed a reputation, much as Pennsylvania did 40 years ago, for just being darn good. And they continue to be just really darn good. They're not that big. They've kind of gotten themselves in a little trouble by being sort of too good for their plant capacity, but there are just good dairy people in the state of Michigan. They're focused on that. They don't allow themselves to get too distracted with other things. The story in Wisconsin that I think might be interesting for Pennsylvania, especially because that Wisconsin dairy industry, or at least the dairy farming part of it, it was so similar to Pennsylvania's in terms of size of farms, numbers of farms, and so on, is when they were in the wilderness, they had a really hard time figuring out how to find their way back. And as I said, as you saw from the slide, it took them better part of 15 years to get that all sorted out. But at the end of the day, the industry at large and the state leadership, elected officials, governors, senators, assemblymen in the state, kind of took the bull by the horns and said, we have got to do some things or we are going to be in the wilderness forever. And they determined that there were three things that were fundamental at the core of their particular challenge. One was Wisconsin dairy farmers in the main hated the thought of some farmers getting bigger. There was a great effort, well, I can tell you, I don't want to belabor this too much, but as Wisconsin farmers started to explore with expanding their business, as other people came into the state, it was pretty brutal. You go to the grocery store and you wouldn't get waited on. You'd go to the church and say you're not welcome here. You'd take your kids to school and they'd be shunned. Literally, this was a difficult situation for those folks that tried to do something different. Eventually, the industry itself said, God loves all its children. This is not about you have to get big. This is not about you can't stay small. This is about respect everybody who's trying to make money, trying to make a living, trying to raise their family on a dairy farm, and let's not cast aspersions on anybody anywhere, and let's make sure the system is available to everyone. The second thing that was critical in the state of Wisconsin was most of the financing, most of the capital for dairy agriculture, or any kind of agriculture, came from community banks. There's farm credit in Wisconsin, of course, but it wasn't the dominant lender as it is in the Northeast. And these small community banks didn't know how to make loans to farmers that wanted to expand. This was outside their wheelhouse. They didn't know how to evaluate somebody that came in and said, yeah, I've got 200 cows and I want to go to 1,500. They had to figure out a way to make that financing feasible. And that was a little bit of state leadership, but also quite a bit of industry involvement to allow that to happen. The third thing was the state of Wisconsin decided that it was going to pass certain regulations, as we have in every state, related to permitting processes and environmental issues and so on. But local communities didn't necessarily agree with the decisions of state legislatures and got in the way. And eventually the state of Wisconsin had to say, stop. We are going to have one set of rules for how you permit a dairy farm, and the township of Adams and the county of Clark cannot overrule the state legislature. Just stop now doing that. Well, that was unhappy for some folks, but it kind of related to this God loves all his children theme that was part of the first effort in that state transformation. Those three things allowed Wisconsin to get out of the wilderness. I have no foggy idea if any of those relate to your environment. You need to find out your own, but that's what was identified as roadblocks and the ways that they went around it. I get asked all the time, what should we do? We should build a special achievement. We should use this. We shouldn't use this. We should do this. We should do that. And I'm going to tell you, the answer to any of this, with Pennsylvania or anywhere else, is not found on page 32 of the Tetra Pak. It's not about buy this, bam, you're all in. Kind of the thing that Professor would say, but the key thing is investing in the people that are in your industry. If you have good people, you will have a successful industry. That's true at the farm level, that's true at the processor level, that's true in the infrastructure that surrounds processors and farmers. That's why I'm good to see a bunch of blue coats sitting in there, because these guys are going to make it go, and people like me are going to fade off and start wondering where the next golf is. That's the way it ought to be. We should be investing in people who are on the ground now, people that will be coming along, and making sure that they will be the best that they can be. And that's what's going to make this industry prosper. It's what I saw in Western New York when I came here 40 years ago. It's what I see when I look at Western Michigan and what's happening here. It's what I see around the U.S. when we try to identify what's a strong, vibrant dairy industry. It's not about quality of the soil. It's not about how many days of sunshine. It's about the people that are trying to make it go.
Thank you, Doctor, for all that information and for joining us today to share your expertise with us. I found it interesting, the information you presented. I represent a district that's up in the northern tier, right on the New York border. My house is about 10 miles from the border, and so I hear from constituents often about minimum milk pricing and about the differences between New York State and Pennsylvania, and how you can go to New York and buy milk at about half the price that you can in Pennsylvania. Maybe not that stark, but it's significant in that people often run over to New York to buy milk to save money. And it's interesting because I've heard from people on both sides of it saying, if you get rid of minimum milk pricing, you could help farmers in Pennsylvania. Certainly retailers have pushed for that for a long time, because if you're a retailer sitting on the border just inside PA, you're very unhappy with that minimum milk price. But it's interesting to see the perspective and really the information that you've presented, and it will help the committee going forward as we look into these issues. So maybe Representative Ryan wants to follow up with his earlier question.
No, and actually, you answered the earlier question. I really appreciate that. That's consistent. I mean, I've heard from about 30 or 40 different folks about the Milk Marketing Board. Some were for it, some were against it, some didn't know whether they were for it or against it, and that was actually helpful. Do you have a written paper behind your slides, if I understood you correctly?
Well, of course, our report, is available. Some of my comments are not necessarily in that report. They're a little extemporaneous. But, yeah, the data for sure is in the report. I'm not sure all of my colorful opinion is, but if you're interested, I could share some of that with you.
I would very much like to, and I'll add in your colorful comments because they were pretty helpful.
Right.
Do you think, I'm a CPA, and so do you think most people I'm just going to say business in general, but in this case in dairy, understand, a lot of times people concentrate on pricing as opposed to cost drivers. And, I've never been in favor of supporting an inefficient farm, inefficient business, whatever. But do you think we have a good enough handle, because accounting systems are not good at tracking cost drivers? Now, we might track cost, but a cost is significantly different than a cost driver. And I'm just curious if you think that most, and that's why Jane's comments I thought were so helpful, most people have a good handle on what is driving their cost to their operations. Is it in economies of scale, diseconomies of scale, inefficiencies, efficiencies, and the like?
Jane put up a slide that showed the incredible range in average costs of production that exist in individual farms. And frankly, that was one of the real eye-openers for me when I first started to look at the New York data when I came to Cornell those years ago. It's amazing the difference between the high cost and the low cost. Keep in mind that, you're not always the low-cost farm. That can change. Sometimes there's particular conditions that result in changes within that distribution. But we know there are a set of farms that can tell you to the fraction of a penny what it costs them to feed a cow, what it costs them to feed that cow versus that cow. And there are other farmers who quite frankly say, well, I opened up my checkbook and there's still money in it, so I guess we're okay. Highly variable in terms of the degree to which farmers pay attention to that sort of thing. As Stan Warren, the famous farm management professor, liked to say to his class 50 years ago, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you don't measure it, you aren't managing it. This is something that's part of this investment in people. Can we do a better job of keeping track of those things? Sometimes I talk to farmers and I say, do you know the difference between your fixed costs and your variable costs? And they go, it's all fixed. I just have to pay all the time. Okay, I get that. I've been on a farm. But that person is saying, I'm a victim of my farm, not that I'm managing my farm. And clearly you can. The last thing I'll say to you is the key thing that I see that's different from when I was a kid is, and you may have been the one who raised this question, is markets are so much more volatile now that the trick is not so much surviving on average, but surviving the bad year long enough to get to the good year. And what we see on the larger scale farms is they have a much greater degree of resilience than is typically true of the smaller scale farm. I don't like using smaller and larger because you can be a good farmer and be small. But as a kind of a general rule, that's really been the trick, is on average I'm okay, but the being able to have the working capital, being able to have the reserves, being able to have some sort of capacity to go from a good year through the bad year is really what's been differentiating folks in the last 10 years.
May I ask just one quick question? Have you seen any studies or any information that might indicate that the large retailers or others might have some predatory pricing capability and market influence ability which would cause a restraint of trade such as, I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work in the automotive industry, and it was not uncommon for some of the large three to tell the supplier, here's what your price will be. Did you see any evidence of that? And that's my last question.
Yeah, not so much. And of course, that's exactly what the resale pricing rules of Pennsylvania are intended to thwart. To say, we have a carefully calibrated system that starts with a farm cost, goes to the wholesaler, then goes to the retailer. It ensures that everybody gets, a reasonable profit, but a retailer cannot push the price down and pass that back to the farmer. That was the whole point of resale price control. In today's market, this is resurfacing as a concern, and Walmart is the great example. Walmart built its business model around controlling its supply chain, and it's clearly now turning its attention to milk, which is raising some concerns for folks. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman,
Representative Zimmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the good information. So just a quick question. What is the one thing that New York is doing that Pennsylvania could learn from? And if I'm a producer here in Pennsylvania, is my chance, or New York, is my chances better to survive in New York than it is Pennsylvania? And if so, why?
One of the great eye-openers to me was when I discovered that the Wright dairy family could make money pretty much any state in the union. If you would have said to me 40 years ago, hey, should I build a bunch of dairy farms in the Texas Panhandle, I would have laughed. I would have said, what are you, crazy? That's nothing. There's nobody lives there. It's all dirt. It never rains. And it's one of the most thriving hot spots for dairy in the United States. This is why I keep coming back to it's the cowboy. The thing that I would say, this gets me in some trouble too, but there is a culture of learning in New York that's I don't really see quite the same degree of in Pennsylvania. And a key piece of that is the pro-dairy program at Cornell. This was started in 1989. I actually wrote the original proposal that was funded by the state of New York. I never was the manager of that program, and it's completely, not anything I have anything to do with now. But it's something that we saw in the late 1980s as we needed to pick up our game. And I'll tell you right now, Pennsylvania was part of the inspiration of that story. We looked at our production per cow, and we looked at other places, including Pennsylvania, and said, how is it that Pennsylvania is doing so much better than we are in production per cow when it's like, we're neighbors, it's not that much different. Well, the point of that story is we made an investment, and I think that investment is paying off. And if you look at the progressive entrepreneurial dairymen, and they come in lots of different sizes, they'll all tell you a Cornell story that relates to people on campus and people in the counties that have been helpful to them. Also, other infrastructure. It's not all about Cornell, but that's one thing I see in New York that I don't see to the same degree in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, very familiar with the program, but thanks. Good stuff. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir, for the information, for traveling to be here with us today. It's very helpful, and it will help the committee greatly. Thank you so much.
You bet.
Our last presenter will be Jeff Ainsley, the Vice President of Red Barn Consulting. Welcome, sir. And you may
pretty fast.
You may proceed when you're ready.
How much time do we have, Kerry?
We were planning to adjourn at 3 p.m.
Okay.
Although we will go past there if necessary.
Do I have? So if I was an auctioneer like Representative Keller, I'd be good. Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'll do my best auctioneer speed voice for Representative Keller here and go fast, because I know I'm keeping you from a meeting. But so I have the great privilege of working for a company called Red Barn Consulting based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Apologies, following the Cornell professor, I am a Cornell grad, grew up on a dairy farm in Cooperstown, New York. My brother manages a 1,200 cow dairy in upstate New York, but I got smart and married a girl from Pennsylvania and moved here 22 years ago, so there we go. So I am lucky enough also to work from Vermont to Virginia, so I have some perspective across multiple states, and I'm happy to share some of that through my few minutes with you here today. But my discussion today is really some observations of the regulatory environment, looking at the farm gate level, standing in the driveway of the clients that I speak to and work for every day. I'm not here to shed any great insights on the regulatory environment from a milk processing standpoint. That's not my space. But I am here to tell you what the farmers I work with are concerned about, what keeps them up at night, and some things I think that you all might be able to help us improve in that respect. So I want to touch base on the types of regulations. I actually want to talk about what's going well. I'm sure this committee is just inundated with calls from constituents about everything that's going well, so we'll share some thoughts there. That was sarcasm, but maybe not. What could be improved? What are the implications at the farm gate? And I just want to finish with some multi-state perspective. So the farmers I work with, we talk about regulations in two buckets. There's operational regulations, nutrient management, conservation planning, my CAFO permit. I have X amount of manure to put down on my farm and my plan says this. Those are operational regulations. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those. There are 6 people in my office that's all they do. That is changing all the time. Those people are dedicated to that space. And so we kind of divide duties in our office that you either work in those regulations and those guidelines or you work in the other group of regulations that I'm going to talk about, which are construction regulations. And why are they important? Is that dairy farming is really a capital-intense business. Farms have to face the reality of expanding and improving facilities if they want to remain competitive and if we want to see environmental gain. This is a big dollar business. Barns, equipment, machinery, it takes a lot of dollars and a lot of capital. And the regulations that impact those investment decisions revolve around earth disturbance, stormwater management, waste management, the space that I work in on a daily basis. So in my experience, if you're getting calls about concerns about regulations, a lot of those calls are really driven by these construction permits. I've been waiting for 6 months for somebody at DEP to tell me where my plan is. I've been waiting. And again, they're capital-intensive projects, capital-intensive businesses, and planning in the face of uncertainty, waiting on permits is challenging. And if you think about why that's challenging, there's really 3 buckets that the farmer worries about. Interest rates. The bank says if we don't get this project started in 90 days, I'm going to go up half a point, and that's $200,000 a year, Jeff. When am I going to get my permit? I hate those calls. Animal biology. The reality on a dairy farm, and this is so, I think I thought about this and I thought, you know what, I'll explain this because I'm not sure we recognize the importance of this enough. It takes 9 months for a cow to give birth to a calf, and it takes 24 months for that animal to actually produce something that the farmer can sell. So there's a 33-month lead time from conception to actually being a productive member of the herd. Compare that to the poultry industry. A fertilized egg hatches in roughly 21, 23 days. The FFA crew probably can correct me if I'm off a day. And a chicken lays an egg in 6 months. So a poultry farmer has roughly a 7-month lead time. We're 4.5 times longer lead time in some of the planning horizons in the dairy industry that we have to work with. And so this certainty around permitting, certainty around this process is really important to our farms. And the growing season is a big factor as well. So I said I was going to share a couple things that are going well. And I'm speaking from perspective here of 8 to 10 years of doing this, 15 years of being involved in dairy facility planning and design. But in general, I really believe state-level permitting is improving. I'm seeing a very, very much improved culture of dialogue and seeking solutions. We can pick up the phone and talk to individuals in leadership at the regional offices of DEP. That is better than it has been in the past. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I want to say that I think we've got some momentum in the right direction, and I'm really encouraged. And I think there's recognition at the highest levels within DEP that agriculture is different. Several folks in my office are part of advisory groups and task force discussion groups trying to share a little bit more of our story in agriculture. And I think Secretary Redding, Secretary McDonald, we see real good collaboration and communication, and my message with this slide is I want to support that and grow that. And so my take is that many of you probably hear nothing but negativity, and I am trying to give you some perspective of 8 to 10 years. The reality is most of my clients are doing this once in their lifetime, and they don't really understand the process. They're not going to do it again. Dad says, I'm not doing this again. This will be juniors next time. So if I had a nickel for every time I've heard that. It's not perfect, but in general, we do see improvement. And if you look at the state regional offices of DEP, there are 6 regions. 80 to 85% of dairy happens in those 2 regions right there. The North Central and South Central Regional Office, that's where the cows are, that's where the permits are, and that's where I want to just take a moment to recognize those regional directors, Marcus Cole in Williamsport and Joe Adams in Harrisburg, have really instituted a culture of trying to be more responsive, trying to be more open-minded, and to work with us. So it's an opportunity just to recognize the good work they're doing and hopefully support that. However, like all good things, there's things we can improve upon, and I want to start by just recognizing or continue to encourage dialogue to recognize that agriculture has very specific solutions. We're not building Walmarts. Unfortunately, we're often going through the same permit process as a Walmart, and that's an important opportunity. We've got best management practices. We've got to identify best management practices that are farm-friendly and farm-specific. Again, the state manual, the BMP manual, if the engineer that does sheets has the same chapter to look at that we have to for a dairy farm, to me there's an opportunity that's being missed, and that's the reality of agriculture. We're working on 100-acre farms and doing a 2-acre project, and Sheets is on 3 acres doing a 3-acre project. So we'd like to encourage the development and more recognition and credit for current agricultural best management practices. Farms are doing a lot of no-till. There's a lot of good things going on farms to get water back into the ground. Right now, the way we scorecard ourselves environmental permit-wise, we don't really recognize any credit for that. That's a huge area of opportunity for agriculture. And I'd like to put a plug in for some simplified, streamlined process for smaller, simpler projects. I had just a quick example. We waited and waited a couple years ago on a permit for a waste storage facility, and over that time, milk prices changed, the farm ran out of capital, and we didn't get the project done. And to me, that's terrible to not get a project permitted when the farm was putting precious capital into an environmental gain project because we were stuck in regulatory struggles. And that's an example where I now know that with Joe Adams, Marcus Cole, we can pick up the phone and get those projects moving in a better manner than we had been in the past. But I will say there are many challenges at the local level. If you ask our office, where do we struggle the most? It's probably really at the local level. There's inconsistencies across municipalities. We have a lot of township engineers trying to figure out where does ag fit in the face of 330 townhome developments and the rapid urbanization of these landscapes. That's a challenge, and that's probably where we spend more of our energy trying to educate the reviewers, educate the regulatory authorities, is at the township or local level. I don't know what can come of it, but we would love to explore tools and outreach to those people to try to help them understand agriculture in a better, more informed way. And I'll say, we have to put the onus on us. As the consultant, we need to do a better job working with our farmers. If any of your offices receive a call from a Red Barn client, there's probably a better than 50% chance that I didn't do a good enough job helping them understand the process. And so I think we have to own that in the consultant world. Farmgate implications, I just want to wrap this up. There are real opportunities for cost savings. If I look at the work we did 10 years ago and look at it today, our bill is 5 times bigger than it was 10 years ago for the same project. Milk price hasn't improved, as you heard from Jane and some of the others. Site work costs are typically twice as much. Excavators tell me all the time, this used to be a $100,000 project, it's now $200,000. And these are compliance, stormwater, earth disturbance regulations that is driving that. I'm not saying we don't want rules and we don't need requirements, but we have to find a way to fit these into more ag-friendly confines, in my opinion. And so unfortunately, this isn't really related to the size of the operation. This actually hurts our small farms more than our large farms. I can show you countless examples, but 150 cow dairy, we might add $1,000 of cost to that project per cow, $1,000 per cow, just in our permitting compliance area. And so recognize if a new facility costs $6,000 or $8,000 per cow to build, and we add $1,000 on top of that, that's significant for a small farm. Improvements in the farm's ability to business plan. If the process is more predictable, we've got a lot better chance for success. And I think there's potential for less reliance on grants and other subsidies to get the environmental gains done on these farms. At the end of the day, the banks only have so much capital they can lend, and if we could find a way to streamline that, strip costs out of that, we can put those dollars into environmental gains and improvements on the farms. So multi-state perspective, I told you I work from Vermont to Virginia. This is 2016 data of where those states ranked in milk production. Just some general observations. All of those states are easier to permit agricultural projects in than Pennsylvania. They all have agricultural exemptions. There's greater consistency across counties and locales. And in general, I would tell you that constructing and permitting a dairy project in Pennsylvania is going to be 2 to 5 times more costly than it is in those other states. It's a higher place to do business in the world I live in for the farmer. So that gives us 7 minutes. I think I'm done. Was that fast enough? Sorry.
That's a lot of
I better
information.
hope I don't get my auctioneer's license, Keller. So
That's a lot of information in a compressed time period. We appreciate it.
Well, based on the questions, I thought we better save some time for questions.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. Thank you very much for the information, and we'll first go to Representative Mao.
God, I don't even know where to start. You did a good job of boiling my blood. I was calm until you spoke about regulations, and let's just get right to the nuts and bolts, DEP. I'm so sick and tired of hearing prospective businesses in Pennsylvania say, screw this, I don't need it. I have a chicken house that wanted to start. Got to keep in mind, I'm an agricultural community. And it got to a point where he just said, pull the plug, we're done. Not even going to bother anymore. This is ridiculous. Have a farmer right now who put in a pipe to cross a ditch that has water in it sometimes a year as wide as this table. And the township come down and said, oh, you can't put those pipes in, you got to get DEP. DEP come in and said, get those things out of there, we're going to fine you. So he went out and got steel plates and laid across this ditch, same steel plates you would have on the highway if they didn't finish the job and need, And sure enough, DEP come right back and said, get those out of there, they're not permitted. The permit and cost to put a steel pipe in, which is still not in, is now going to exceed $10,000 till he's done with the head walls, to cross a ditch that is dry most of the summer. You touched on a problem that I've been screaming about for years, and hopefully someday we'll get an administration that says DEP is out of control and it's really costing Pennsylvanians a lot of good business. That being said, I understand why people don't want to expand their farming operations when they have all those hoops to go jump through, and you say it's 2 to 5 times higher to start or increase a dairy farm here than it is in other states. Am I correct in saying basically it's the environmental aspect of it?
Yeah, it absolutely is.
So we're talking about DEP.
And I'm speaking in general terms. I need to be careful. Every site is different. Every site-specific condition is different. But in general, that's what we see. And I hope you heard the message. I see that it's improving the dialogue. The permitting right now is going better than it was. Far from where we'd like it to be. I really hope that if you look at that slide when you can about things we can improve upon, I think there's low-hanging fruit that we need to in agriculture tell that story. It's just when we have a 100-acre farm that has to go through the same work and lift that Sheets does on 3 acres, and they're going to put 2.9 of it under roof and under blacktop. I feel like there's a disconnect, and the momentum is there. We're starting to open that conversation. The manual is being revisited for more agricultural friendly practices, but it takes time. So,
thank you. I'll go take a Xanax or something now.
Drink a chocolate milk.
Representative Zimmerman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Jeff, for being here and sharing. Jeff, you mentioned the local level, and I agree. We have there's a real confusion at the township level and on, what the regulations mean and trying to interpret what DEP wants and doesn't want, and half the time they don't know either. And so then you have such a big disparity between townships because of it. And that's not fair to our farmers, it's not fair to any business. What can we actually do? Educate? Do you have any thoughts on that with the work that Red Barn does? How can we make sense out of that and have our local community, our townships, kind of up to speed and maybe on the same page?
Yeah, it's true. In our office, a project comes in, the first discussion we have is where is it located and who's reviewing it, because how we plan and how we move forward is different. And it can be, and it's not a Lancaster County versus Crawford County discussion. It can be a Raffo Township versus East Donegal Township in Lancaster County. That's a really complex question, and I don't know the answer. I'd love to see us find a way to bring those reviewers, bring the people in leadership positions together, so that maybe it's the State Association of Township Supervisors. I mean, maybe that's a venue to do breakouts or workshops within those groups to really help the curve. A lot of these review engineers at the township level have a municipal background, a commercial construction, and they don't know the first thing. We spend time explaining, no, the cow lives in the barn and then she goes here, and I understand. I mean, I don't know the first thing about a Class A office building, but I don't have a great answer other than it's an area we need to address because it's not getting better.
Yeah, appreciate that, but somehow I agree that's one of our major problems right now. So thanks, Jeff, appreciate it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Any additional questions? If not, thank you very much for the information that you presented. I want to thank all of our testifiers today. It's a tremendous amount of information, and I think it will benefit the committee as we move forward in tackling, as best we can, challenges facing the dairy industry. Up next in 2 minutes is the House Appropriations Committee budget hearing for the Department of Agriculture, so you're all invited to join us there. This meeting's concluded. Thank you.